Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. This makes it a full work week of streams from Monday to Friday, including actually the Sunday before that. So, no matter how you define your work week, I am definitely filling it out with daily streams. Hope you are enjoying it. We, of course, had a lot to talk about this week as we transitioned from AirPods reviews, Apple Watch reviews, to iPhone reviews. There was a lot to react to, a lot to analyze, because yes, we don't simply watch videos, we actually do transformative content over here, where we watch something and let our opinions be heard, including not just the product itself, but also the reviewing process and some of the issues we might have with it, or sometimes we just simply praise another YouTuber or a tech outlet. We are definitely not above that. And really, joining the instant the stream starts, welcome to the stream, brother. I see my stream is working fine. I see a few people are already joining. That's very, very encouraging. This week has been really, really good for live engagement. So as you guys slowly tune in, I will, of course, let you know what we are talking about today. As you can guess from the title, our main topic of today is Geekerwan's review of the iPhone 16 and 16 Pro in general. However, they are focused on the A18 chips more precisely. So this is probably the most nerdy we have yet gotten when it comes to the iPhone 16. Granted, the camera stuff was pretty nerdy too. But I think this makes it even more exciting, realizing finally the good stuff. I know a lot of you watch me for these kinds of videos. That being said, we are anything but done after today analyzing the A18 and A18 Pro. I actually just wanted to show you guys some stuff. A18 benchmark. So Tom's Guide. Tom's Guide, I think, had some newer stuff too. But I just wanted to show you guys, like, when it comes to actual like performance analysis. Oh my God, what is up with these websites? Uh, so you can already see, by the way, that they really like the multi-core results here for the A18 are already pretty garbage. So there aren't even that many devices. There's for some reason the Pro isn't here. Where do they have it for the 16 Pro Max? Where do they have performance? So you can see that in multi-core scores, yes, that's decent, but we have gotten results as high as 8800, so who knows. Adobe Premiere Rush, we definitely see that the iPhone here is superior, twice the speed of the Galaxy S24 Ultra, small uplifts over the 15 Pro Max. The issue I have is once we get here to Steel Nomad Lite and 3D Mark Solar Bay, because these results are false. They're either buggy or they used a device that was like, I don't know, like thermally saturated or something like that. Even the iPhone 15 Pro Max already gives you like 12 FPS and still no Met Light. So the fact that we are seeing what would effectively be a downgrade over here, and especially a downgrade over like the Galaxy S24 Ultra, is pretty ridiculous. We also have like completely baffling missing benchmarks, like for the iPhone 15 Pro Max and stuff like that. Now we have covered battery tests as well already, but and then there were like there was one from PC Mac that I really wanted to show you. A18 benchmark PC Mag. So when you go inside here, you'll find that they have a couple of tests. Is that the newest one that I watched today? So for one, I just wanted to briefly say the Antutu comparisons from iPhone to iPhone are fair. You can never use Antutu for between cross-platform comparisons. So just so you know that, whenever people bring up, oh, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is already at like 2 million or something like that, that's not relevant data. You cannot compare Antutu between cross-platform. That's not what the benchmark was made for. Of course, here you can already see that The testing is a little bit iffy because the results are definitely lower, but then I've also seen some data. I don't know if it was this article, because the article that or was it like the notebook check thing? No, they're just aggregating other stuff apparently. No journalism themselves. What are they? Are they Mark Tech here? No, but I've seen tests where the A18 Pro was somehow 2 times slower than the A17 Pro in, I believe, in a 3D Mark test, something like that. Not one of the newer ones, but one of the older ones. I'm just trying to tell you guys, it's getting increasingly harder and harder to find good data. So if you really look at all these websites, you see they take data from like random Chinese YouTube channels. I've already seen on Twitter that some encoding stuff was on like a notable Chinese YouTube account was tested wrongly, where they were using like different encoding settings and stuff like that. And then Western websites that for some reason cannot be bothered to actually do the testing themselves are just copy pasting the bait data. We have baffling like missing data from like somehow it was impossible for them to get new results from the A16 from the A17 devices. So yeah, I just wanted to tell you the reason why I wait is not because I'm lazy. I obviously have done plenty of streaming this week, but the benchmarks, I think they are worse than they have ever been. Like an Antec missing is already bad for the industry in general. I think that people are just confused on how to properly set up mobile devices, especially in the first week when the device is still like usually preoccupied more with background processes. But yeah, if you're somebody who really wishes to get the highest quality data, which includes me, you definitely have to do your due diligence and not rely on just basically any kind of data you can find. That will always lead you astray, unfortunately. Relay, you're saying there's now like 2 battery tests on YouTube as well, where we are getting to some battery stuff in this video as well. So this has been the intro for today. I just wanted to tell you why I'm doing my streaming schedule the way I am. I could have, of course, reacted to Geekerwan's video at least yesterday. I think the day before that is when it originally came out. But I did wait a little bit to see if they're somewhat on the better side than the bullshit that I saw from other outlets. They definitely are. I still have some issues with some of Geekerwan's methodology. We will cover that as we go through the video. But before we get fully started, I do want to encourage you guys to please do all the YouTube jazz, as we call it around here. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment. I love interacting with you guys. Share the video out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And of course, if you have some extra cash, feel free to support the channel directly while I'm live. Leave a small super chat or super sticker right in the live chat. Any small donation is very much appreciated. And if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, you can do so via YouTube channel membership. Shout out to Fizz, Angelica, and Max Maximus, who are all MarkTech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube. And you can also become a supporter over on Patreon. Yeah, so that's about it for the very intro stuff. Relay, you asked for some battery. We actually do have some hard data on the battery, which is really cool, which is we now know the actual battery capacities of the 16 series. We have actually got now more detailed breakdowns of and teardowns of the devices, so we actually know how the batteries look and function inside. And one thing that really stands out is that the old rumor that the 16 Plus would get a notable capacity downgrade from around 4,400 milliampere hours down to 4,000 is wrong. So all the other uplifts are pretty much in line with what we expected, with the biggest upgrade happening on the 16 Pro versus the 15 Pro, up 9.4%, being now basically the same capacity as the 16 that sees a slightly smaller upgrade over the smaller 15, and of course the 16 Plus Plus gets its 6.6% upgrade over last gen, and then the 16 Pro Max gets technically the smallest uplift percentage-wise of 6%, brings it around 4,700 milliampere hours, which is obviously much closer to the sort of standard 5,000 that we see from devices like the Galaxy S24 Ultra, 23 Ultra, 22 Ultra, that we're going to see in the Galaxy S25 Ultra. So definitely nice that Apple is pushing efficiency across the screen technology for the pros, across the processor for all of those devices. Of course, the 16 and 16 Plus have a 2-generational processor jump from the A16 to the A18, so they jump not from a 3-nanometer process to a second generation 3-nanometer process, but from N4 to N3E, so that helps with efficiency and therefore battery life. And the 16 Pros jump from an N3B A17 Pro processor to an N3E A18 Pro processor, so that's very much expected. We of course know Apple's officials guidelines, where we see even some really big gains, like 4 hours more of video playback for the iPhone 16 Pro Max. That being said, we do have additional data. Mr. Who's the Boss, battery life. Okay, nobody has yet written it down in an article. So we are gonna go there, Mr. Who's the Boss.
These are the iPhone.
So his testing basically found the following. Where is it? Where is it? So the iPhone 15 Pro Max ended up in his battery life test, which consists of a lot of mixed usage, at 9 hours and 35 minutes. And then the 16 Pro Max notably overperformed it by almost 2 hours at 11 hours and 22 minutes. And then in his test, the Galaxy S24 Ultra actually noticeably improved, supposedly thanks to software updates, over how it performed when it initially came out, and actually ended up overperforming the 16 Pro Max. That is one result. When we look at the TechChap channel, a really good channel. Shout out to the guy whose name I somehow forget all the time. But when we actually look at the final battery life results here, when it's actually over. So we see actually in his test, the Galaxy S24 Ultra performs much more in line with previous testing. So it didn't get some magical 2-hour battery upgrade or something thanks to software. The iPhone 15 Pro Max does overperform the S24 Ultra already by a little, which is the case. That is basically how we usually see these tests go. We see, of course, that the 16 series then actually improves basically across the board on every previous iPhone except the 15 Pro Max, and then the 16 will give you a little over 9 hours, as does the 16 Pro, and then the 16 Pro Max will give you an incredible 11 hours and 29 minutes, which is a full 2-hour gain over the 15 Pro Max, which again, you can see, by the way, how his results are very much in line with Mr. Who's the Boss's. So however their methodology works, it seems to be similar, except for one device here, which is the Galaxy S24 Ultra, which notably performs much more in line with the 15 Pro Max than the 16 Pro Max, which, if you actually think about it, makes a lot of sense. And then his absolute battery champ here, actually, well, for one, shout out to the Honor M6 Pro, which a device I didn't even know really existed, still overperforms the 16 Pro Max by a little bit. And then the Vivo X100, which isn't even their latest flagship, the X200 is soon to come out, does overperform the 16 Pro Max by an hour. So these two are basically in a league of their own, with the Vivo still being ahead, and then we see like a very like formidable, still like usable range of devices between the Galaxy S24 Ultra, the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, and apparently even the Pixel 9 Pro XL in his specific testing. That being said, when we actually jump to Mr. Who's the Boss's video. Did he test the Pixel this year? No, he didn't. So usually the Pixel just completely underperforms in these tests. It does have a very efficient screen, so that helps if you especially try to compare like very neutral usage, like video playback maybe. But whenever you really start to go into browsing, you feel that the modem is worse than what you get on other flagships. Of course, whenever you try gaming or something like that, not only do you end up with noticeably worse battery life, but you actually do have also to deal with the fact that your actual gaming performance will be half of the competition. So this is why I usually refer always back to GSM Arena here, which again, I'm still really waiting for tests of the iPhone on this website, because I really like their comprehensive battery testing. I like their very standardized brightness testing. So, for example, like just they published a Pixel 9 Pro review. When you look, for example, well, for one, a shout out to their high display brightness. But then when you look at battery life, of course, it's still decent, depending on what specific use case you target. But you do have to account for the fact that you get that decent battery life at basically abysmal levels of performance. So usually, like, you would kind of have to actually take almost like the iPhone 15 Pro Max and put it into low power mode, and then it would perform very similar to what the Pixel does. And then, of course, it would completely destroy it in battery life. Now, yes, it would change some other settings, of course. Like, this is why we usually don't do that kind of testing. But if we could, that, of course, would be absolutely game-changing. And yes, again, Antutu not comparable between different operating systems, stuff like that. So the inclusion here of the iPhone 15 is actually pretty dubious, but whatever. But if you actually compare it Android to Android, you can see the Pixels are notoriously like below 1 million still, which would put them more in line with like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is soon about to be 2 generations old, of course. And the Galaxy S24 Ultra isn't even like the highest performer in these tests. And 3D Mark, these are completely outdated tests. These are tests that are also now prone to bugs because they simply don't get updated often enough. This is one of the tests where I actually saw, I believe it was PC Mac, again, can prove it, like showed that the 16 Pro Max gave you like half the performance of the 15 Pro Max. The Apple's chips usually completely underperform in these tests. Like, you will have like iPhone delivering 30, 40, 50, 60% more like performance in real games versus the Pixel, 10, 15% more performance than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. And then in these tests, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, which for one, like also is also a little unpredictable sometimes, will somehow be like 80% faster in these tests. So these tests, I would completely eliminate the old 3D Mark tests. Solar Bay, in my opinion, is also not very good. Steel Nomad Lite seems to be the actual flagship like test that currently exists. I wish they would expand it with more advanced ray tracing options. So maybe we would just have Steel Nomad Lite normal and Steel Nomad Lite ray traced. So that would work well. But these old tests, and to a degree even Solar Bay, which I feel was like a very throwaway test that they even admitted was very light on actual ray tracing inside. It scales in very bizarre ways, so it doesn't seem to scale at all with real games. Zenless Zone Zero, Genshin Impact, Wuthering Waves, all these new, more advanced games. Of course, Call of Duty Mobile, Call of Duty Warzone Mobile, like all these games that where the iPhone usually is either in line, and I'm talking here about the A17 Pro iPhones with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, or overperform it, or match it, maybe slightly loose, but do it with like 40% lower power consumption. These tests, for some reason, like just don't reflect those realities. So again, I just wanted to briefly give you some understanding of the actual landscape of testing. So even a website that I will usually praise on this channel will unfortunately not always perform as well as I think they should. Like, I think at this point, it's pretty much time to eliminate certain tests. So that's about it for this one. And now let's see actually if we can see if Geekerwan does a better job. Now that we're almost half an hour into the video, please stay tuned in. So downloads. And here's Geekerwan. Of course, this is the Chinese version. There is no English-speaking version. They haven't barely updated their English channel in 11 months, basically in a year to be precise, almost, because of course, the iPhone. Because like their last test was like the A17 Pro on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, and somehow since then I think they decided that maybe the English-speaking audience wasn't worth the effort, but that's about what I take from it. And Max Maximus saying, finally I can join live. That's really great, brother. I know you usually join in afterwards, so, and you also are a great supporter of this channel, so that's very much appreciated. So I do have to watch it in Chinese. I will tune the volume down, obviously, because now my voice matters a lot more. I have configured it, obviously, in a way where the subtitles are not like covered or something like that. I'll just zoom in a little bit to make sure you see about as much as possible without me covering too much. If I have my iPad on the side where I can see the stream, so that way I hopefully don't cover anything up where it's like anything actually interesting in terms of the benchmark. If I do, you feel free to let me know if too much data is getting lost.
又到了1年1度的 iPhone 评测，相信大家已经等了很久了，就等着看看我们的性能和能效。你看，这不就来了吗？
Okay, I think that due to language barriers, I don't want to have faster than just a regular playback speed.
全系又一次标配了新一代处理器啊，标准版没有再沿用上代的芯片了，而是换上了一颗全新的 A18 Pro 版本，用上了 A18 Pro。那这标准版的 A18。
By the way, I don't even know if this is in the video. I've seen that the main difference between, of course, the one disabled GPU core on the A18 versus the A18 Pro seems to be that system level cache, which is 24 megabytes on the A18 Pro and on the A17 Pro, and I believe also on the A16. And I believe actually on the A15 it was slightly higher, 32 megabytes. But then Apple increased memory bandwidth, so they thought they could skimp a little bit on system level cache. At least that's as far as I remember. Of course, feel free to let me know if I'm wrong on something. And then, but the A18 basically has half, which is a pretty significant downgrade over the A18 Pro. So while that won't impact really things like single core performance much, it can impact multi-core performance a little bit, because of course system level cache can be accessed by components like the CPU, the GPU, the neural engine. So some tasks might perform pretty identical if the task is actually so small that it just still comfortably fits into a 12 megabyte system level cache. Of course, the individual CPU cores have their own cache still. The GPU cores have a little bit of cache. They have also their own tile memory, which is a little harder to define the exact capacity. And then, of course, the chip itself has also the memory, the actual LPDDR5X 7500 megatransfers per second memory, which is the same bandwidth between A18 and A18 Pro. So if you have a task that can fit sort of in that, you will basically see identical performance. If a task is a little too large, you might actually see significant performance gains on the A18 Pro versus the A18. However, it's hard to really say which tests will be, see which advantages. I also would like to talk about differences potentially between encoders and decoders from these devices. Seemingly there are none, like at least not officially. Whatever benchmarks we have gotten thus far, there is one benchmark that shows like, well, there can be still some differences in like exporting times, but of course, because there are other differences than just the encoder, but seemingly I haven't found any good benchmark thus far. I've seen on Twitter today one benchmark being posted where the 18 was like half in terms of export time, or like twice as half as fast or twice as slow, I guess, as the 18 Pro, but that test was like run the wrong way. So there were different using I believe on accident, like different encoder settings between the different processors. So or maybe there was a bug there, or who knows. But yeah, I'm just inclined for now to take as few benchmarks as possible, but then make sure they're as high quality as possible. YouTube Kulanchizi joining the chat, also a long-time supporter here. What's interesting in the discussion around the 18 is been down 18 Pro or completely separate chip. It's been down. It's definitely been down. Again, that encoding test was wrong. It was using different tests. Also, by the way, you can something like encoding might be limited like by a thing like system level cache. There might be differences in export speeds that come from different storage that might be used between the 18 and the 18 Pro. Unfortunately, I have not yet seen any storage speeds, but I 100% don't believe those are actually different dies. It just wouldn't make sense logistically. The cutbacks are just not enough for that. Even the system level cache is some would like say, well, that's a huge binning effort. Well, yeah, it allows Apple to basically say, if we have a chip that has one GPU core disabled, we're just going to disable, well, that it has a GPU core that doesn't work, so we're just going to make it from the 18 Pro to the A18, and then we're also going to disable some system level cache. Obviously, we don't need as much because now we have less GPU performance in theory. We still can rely on the memory bandwidth, but now if you also have a chip that might have some imperfections in the actual cache, which because the cache doesn't scale as well with smaller nodes, the cache actually ends up taking more and more space percentage-wise of the actual processor. So if the cache might be hurt, quote unquote, maybe of 24 megabytes, you end up only with 20 or even only 16, right? So you just do a hard cut, you disable half the cache, and now you made an A18 Pro to A18. So technically, while the binning might actually be the same result, there might be different reasons to bin the individual dies that you get. We might discuss more about it deeper into the video. Don't want to keep you too busy. Well, I think it's still interesting because Geekerwan themselves usually start with like a discussion of the architecture. I actually haven't done too much research on like the pipeline there, like how many decoder stuffs it has or whatever. So this might actually give me more info than I have before, and this is why I actually encourage you guys to share data with me. But please be careful, because like I said, YouTube Kulanchizi, that benchmarks that you shared, it is what I saw basically 2 hours ago when I was doing final prep for this video, and then I found that unfortunately that data is flawed.
多少？高端的 A18 Pro 又 Pro 在哪里呢？ iPhone 的散热到底有没有改善？续航又怎么样？
We are also going to talk about heat dissipation. Don't worry about that.
游戏实测散热。
I still don't understand why we need Geekbench 5 in this. I've already said I don't take anything in the wildlife testing seriously. And I obviously don't speak Chinese, so I don't know what he's talking about here. I know, and this is one thing that I have seen, is that they seem to have a dedicated their own like a ray tracing test, which actually seems to scale with Apple's 2x promise, which also seems to scale better on iPhone from A17 Pro to A18 Pro than the M3 scales up to the M4. So that might actually be indicative of a real new, at least like ray tracing related architecture inside the A18 Pro that we might yet not have seen even on M4 iPad Pros. And my speculation was that if there is a notable architectural change in M4 Pro and M4 Max versus M4, my speculation is that the most likely one would be that it would be some change in encoders. We saw some of that going from the M1 to the M1 Pro, where we added ProRes actually, which then became also standard on M2. And the other thing is that I could actually see some GPU changes, because we actually saw some of that to a very small degree in the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, where some people said it actually has had some of the GPU changes, not a lot, but that later came with the M2 generation standard. So maybe just the ray tracing improvements might be on the M4 Pro and M4 Max, which of course also would make sense, because those devices are most likely to be used for stuff like Blender and more intensive games. Hopefully we finally get some good ray tracing supporting games on macOS. But yeah, so a lot of data to consider. Like my head sometimes hurts when I try to really combine it all together. Spec 2017 is a very good neutral test. Unfortunately, as the name suggests, it is not very up to date at this point. Like you can say a lot about Cinebench, and I have certainly said a lot about Cinebench R23, especially to morons who believe that it was somehow indicative of Apple Silicon having like 30-40% less performance than comparative Intel chips. And now that of course Apple overperforms it, now that the company has finally come out and said, yeah, we actually bothered to optimize for Apple Silicon for now, because ARM is also getting more important on Windows in general. Now of course we see Cinebench results where the M3 is already ahead of basically anything available on x86, and of course M4 with higher IPC, higher clock speeds should pull further ahead as Intel now launches Arrow Lake and Lunar Lake, and AMD hopefully gives us something Zen 5 based that is 3 nanometer, because on 4 nanometer it's definitely not the hottest shit ever, unfortunately, as a gen-to-gen upgrade. It's still a good architecture overall, because Zen 4 was a good architecture, but yeah. It is what it is, as I usually say. And guys, we've been streaming for about half an hour. There are a few of you now watching. I want to encourage you all to do the YouTube jazz, as we call it on this channel, to please subscribe to the channel, like the video, keep commenting live. I love interacting with you all. Share the video out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And of course, if you want to support us here directly, and again, us is pluralis majestatis, for just me being stupid, please feel free to leave a small super chat or super sticker donation live here in the live chat, or consider becoming a channel member right here on YouTube, or a supporter over on Patreon. Any small donation goes a long way here.
几个方面来帮你好好了解一下这代新 iPhone 的性能表现。先预告一下啊，这次新 iPhone 的能效进步相当的大，比它的外观变化可大多了。那到底是怎么回事呢？话不多说，咱们正式开始吧。首先给大家简要介绍一下这 A18 和 A18
The subtitles
Pro
can
是什么玩意儿
go outside the
A18
range,
和
so
A18 Pro 都基于台积电最新的 N3E 工艺，它们都搭载了更宽的 CPU 核心，提升了光追性能的 GPU。 全系配备 LPDDR5
Okay,
8G 内存。
okay, those are all very, very solid analysis points. Nothing too crazy here yet. Faster memory, we said that. LPDDR5X 7500. A GPU architecture that seems to be really focused on improving ray tracing, and a CPU that is wider still, because of course Apple has been like going wider and wider over the last couple of years. M4 of course being where it's at, and A18 basically following in those footsteps, because it's pretty much the same CPU architecture.
带宽呢比上代大了15%。
The bandwidth upgrade is pretty much, I believe, exactly 17%. But yeah, okay.
那 CPU 方面的两颗 A18共享了来自于 M4 的相同核心架构。频率也完全一样。
One shout out to the analysis that for years has now been basically proven true is that Apple uses the iPhone, like the new P cores that they introduce on the new Note or just a better architecture, and then they clock it on pretty much the same clock speeds as the previous generation Apple Silicon M series chips. So for a little over under 4.1 gigahertz is where we actually found the clock speed of the M3 generation. Of course, M4 now sits at 4.4. The iPhone basically matches that clock speed of the M3 by jumping from N3B to N3E and a slightly newer architecture, because I'm pretty sure if everything else was equal between M3 and A18 Pro, we would be very much in a situation where the power consumption on the A18 Pro would be too high to actually give you those clock speeds.
是大核最高4.05 G 赫，小核最高2.42 G 赫。那这个呢也应该是
2.4 gigahertz. This is where our discussion of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 should come in, because in that 18 watt result that we analyzed that showed like 10,000 points in Geekbench 6, their efficiency cores were clocked at like 3.6 gigahertz or something ridiculous like that, and then their performance cores at 4.3 gigahertz. Their E-cores would basically be downclocked Orion like performance cores, maybe with some cache count out or something like that. There would be 6 of those. So if you think that the A18 Pro and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 exist anywhere near the same realm of power consumption in terms of multi-core results, you are just, I have so many bridges to sell you. It's not even funny.
像第一颗突破4G 赫兹大关的处理器A18和A18 Pro 的区别主要有2方面，一方面呢是它们的缓存容量不同，另一方面则是 GPU 的规模不同。而这2项差别呢，具体在实际性能当中会造成多大的影响，我们接下来也会来详细测测看。那我们就一样一样来说吧，先来聊一聊 CPU 的微架构。那由于 M4 呢已经在今年5月份首发在了今年的 iPad Pro 上，那 A18 系列的2颗处理器呢，自然就沿用了 M4 上的微架构。相较于去年 A17 Pro 和 M3 的微架构 ，M4 和 A18 所使用的新核心规模更大了 ，P 核的解码单元宽度从9宽扩充到了10宽。
Okay, so decoding units basically are on the same level as the M4, which puts it also ahead of A17 Pros and M3's architecture, which had the same performance cores. Again, this makes absolute sense. Obviously, Apple isn't going to use drastically different performance cores between A and M series processors. Just doesn't make sense from an engineering effort perspective. So yeah, definitely very happy to see some of that.
那这颗 P 核呢，也是当之无愧的目前所有处理器里规模最庞大的一颗。A18和 A18 Pro 用的都是这个新 P 核。那它的性能呢，我们已经在 M4 上领教过了。不过从 M4 来到手机里之后，我会更好奇它的能效表现是否有所提升啊。那除了微架构上的提升 ，M4 和 A18 还增加了
scalable matrix executions. Of course, we also have like the width of that to consider with AVX against like stuff like AVX 512 and whatever. So with Intel also like I believe though Ryzen does differentiate here as well with how they treat like AVX instructions between their mobile Zen 5 and their desktop Zen 5, but that is not at the core of this video, of course. But yes, Intel does vary between like the generation. Sometimes they disable AVX 512 and whatever, so they're very, very fidgety on that. But yes, Apple has gone really, really aggressive with scalable matrix executions. It seems like the MediaTek Dimensity 9400 that will be based on ARM's latest X925 core. design, which would be also based on the latest ARM v9.2 architecture, will also support scalable matrix executions. If it does so to the same extent, because SME is an optional part of the ARM v9 standard, remains to be seen. And of course, the upcoming Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 will be well, at least partially impaired by the fact that it's still an ARM v8 based device, so it is pretty much cannot support SME, but we also know it doesn't from the Orion cores inside the Snapdragon X Elite. Let me just very briefly answer a very, very small, short message. Okay.
基于对未来 AI 应用加速的考量，那即将到来的 ARM 公版 X925 核心也会引入 SM。
Okay, so you can basically see that I only skimmed this video in the past. Obviously, they do cover a lot of technical details as well.
缓存部分呢，发布会上说了 A18 Pro 有更大的缓存，但没有说大了多少，所以我们也做了缓存深度测试。看起来啊 ，A18 的2G 缓存和 SLC 缓存相比 A18 Pro 都砍半了。A18 Pro 和 A17 Pro 的缓存规格一致，都是2颗大核共享16兆2G 缓存，再搭配24兆的 SLC 缓存。那么 A18 呢，则分别砍半到了2颗大核共享8兆的2G 缓存 ，SLC 缓存呢则缩小到12兆，这个阉割幅度啊可不小了。但考虑到市面上其他处理器的缓存配置呢，也就跟 A18 差不多。那这一刀下去，到底能赢什么？
Yeah, so if you look at it, of course, the A18 Pro still ends up with a lot more cache than before. Now, the upcoming X925 architecture that will be part of the MediaTek Dimensity 9400 will actually double cache levels here. Of course, Apple does have here those additional 4 megabytes. So while it is a notable cutback over the A18 Pro, this is where Snapdragon, of course, still cannot compete. The Orion cores will give you more cache, but I believe it would still make it like put it behind the A18 Pro. So if you wonder why Apple might have not seen it necessary to keep 32 megabytes of SLC or go further beyond that, that's because the competition has been lacking. And if you ever wonder why Snapdragon might not perform really well in real-world games in comparison to what you might expect, for example, from it using higher memory bandwidth, right? Like most Snapdragon 8 Gen 3s use 8500 megatransfers memory, which of course goes beyond the 7500 on the A18 and the A18 Pro, and way beyond the 6400 megatransfer rate that we see on the A17 Pro and the A16. Well, that's because memory bandwidth or overall chip bandwidth is defined by way more than just raw memory bandwidth. It's also defined by the amount of cache that you have, be it L2, L3, system level cache, even stuff that I mentioned in the past, like tile memory on the GPU, and of course it also depends on how it's getting utilized. For example, Apple introduced dynamic caching on the A17 Pro and M3 generation. That seems to help along. So yeah, if you're somebody who really wants to understand those architectures, and I don't claim that I'm an expert here, these details really, really matter.
影响多少性能，现在还真不好说。那除了 CPU 以外啊 ，GPU 也沿用了 M4 的 GPU 架构，只是规模有所减少。那么 M4 呢是10核 GPU，A18 Pro 呢则给了6。
I think my biggest surprise on the M4 was actually that it didn't have 12 GPU cores to just be double the iPhone, which, given that it has literally twice the memory bandwidth, that cache, of course, scales with it having like more performance cores, it just made sense to me. So while on the M3, I could still kind of understand it because the efficiency of the chip might have not been too great, so Apple might have not wanted to like really scale the GPU up too much. Of course, as the nodes get more expensive, Apple also doesn't want to make the chips unnecessarily large. much, which, for example, if you look at the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, that one is like 30 to 40% larger than Apple's A series chips usually. So if you ever wonder why it might sometimes beat it, well, even like being on an older node, well, that comes from them just really throwing more and more transistors at it where they can, or at least more space even to a degree, which does help with stuff like cooling a little bit. But yeah, this is one disappointing aspect of the M4. I really would have liked to see 12 GPU cores, and at least that would have been a good promise, for example, that on the M4 Pro we would finally see a GPU count increase, because obviously the M3 Pro was actually a GPU count decrease versus the M2 Pro, and then the M3 Max still kept like the same 40 GPU compute units as the M2 Max, and I would have hoped on the M4 Max to jump to something like 48 GPU cores. Again, this is not really like highbrow analysis. This is just me saying what I would have hoped to see.
A18上的 GPU 呢就阉割成了5核了。
I love that it
上代的
translates
A18
into
Pro
castrated.
M3 的 GPU 相比呢，A18的这个新 GPU 架构并没有大幅度的变化，依然属于 Apple GPU Family 9家族，但光追性能的提升还是很大的。我们魔改了一个光追演示 demo 用来测试性能啊。A18 Pro 的光追性能。
Yeah, so this is again. They say it shows that it's a 3D Mark test. I don't know which 3D Mark it is. When they say demo here, it seems maybe it's not really available as a mass test, which of course does lead me to other questions like how they sideload stuff onto iPhones and things like that, which of course leads me also to the question of how optimized some of those sideloaded things are versus of course stuff that might be officially available from the App Store. That being said, of course, it's I had to just briefly answer something here. I apologize. This is why I have gotten my 17, my 7 Plus. Not even. I wanted to say my 17 Pro, but that is obviously only going to happen next year. So let me briefly. Okay. So you can see that we have a 91% uplift in ray tracing performance. I believe that there's just a translation issue where it just calls it light tracing, which obviously does make sense between the words ray and light. But also I would argue that this is, of course, a larger uplift, much larger potential uplift than what we see from the M3 to the M4. So let's hope that means in general that we have a better architecture here still. But at least that's also their analysis, which if this test, by the way, exists, please if it's available, please let me know, because that's one thing that really confused me with Solar Bay. Solar Bay just really seemed to scale weirdly. We have seen some games that do have ray tracing. I believe it's Warships or whatever, War Thunder Ships, you know, the game that is like War of Tanks but with ships. I believe that one has ray tracing, and I believe the Snapdragon chip actually slightly overperformed the A17 Pro in that real-world game, but by a little. Versus like in Solar Bay, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 somehow was like winning by 50-60%, where like it had results in like the 8,000 range and the iPhone was like in the 5,000 range. So yeah, I'm really confused which test they're exactly using here, but if this one is correct, this does of course invite what we have talked about on the Apple side here. Let me just one last message here. Where I was gonna go. And Angelica joining the chat as I finish my chats, saying that she's starting into the weekend and enjoying the stream for now, which I'm very, of course, glad to provide some early weekend entertainment for you guys. So when we actually look at what Apple has promised here on their website for the A17 Pro, which you have to scroll quite a bit because the camera matters more, of course. Camera. Which I guess this is what provoked The Verge to make 80% of their testing about the camera. But yeah, so new 6-core GPU. So they do say it's a new GPU. It's not just simply faster. It's a new 6-core CPU, which of course there we know much more, that a lot has changed architecturally. We know the memory bandwidth changes. And then specifically when we compare to the 15 Pro Max, we'll see like, oh, the actual GPU uplift is not that significant. It's around 20%, but they do promise up to 2 times faster hardware accelerated ray tracing than the A17 Pro. So however they have made this benchmark, I really want to actually commend them. And this is where I really begrudge myself like my lack of the Chinese language, because I would love to fully understand what the website says and just get the test for myself, or really encourage maybe other reviewers to actually get that test. And hopefully such a big uplift in like ray tracing performance actually means that more games will consider including it. Not to say, of course, that maybe a raster based game would still be more advantageous, given that you still want like 60 FPS usually, but this now makes it much more likely to be viable.
翻倍的提升啊！看来苹果发布会上确实没唬人。然而嘛，手机上聊光追，哪怕你提升再大，目前啊还是有点太超前。
True. That is absolutely correct. This is where I do like these guys. They really do seem to know, of course, what games are out there, what games people are actually playing, what settings those games have. So this is partially why I cannot fathom some of their final conclusions sometimes in the reviews. But if you look at like just how many mobile games have ray tracing, it's like 2 or 3 or something like that.
也许过阵子会发布的 M4 Mac， 我们再来详细聊聊会更合适。 那么了解了 A18 到底是个啥，我们就该请出行业标准 Spec 2017来看看新 CPU 到底
how successful the CPU is。
单核性能到底有多强呢？在 4.0 G 赫左右的峰值频率下 ，A18 Pro 比 A17 Pro 整数强了13%，浮点强了23%啊。 P 核的峰值性能综合提升了18%。
So that's integer and floating point performance, 13, 23%. Actually, when you go in between there, and average them, it's an 18% uplift, which does line up very well with what Apple promises. Apple promises us here 15% faster CPU, 20% faster GPU. Of course, there is the 17% uplift in memory bandwidth. So if you ever thought, well, why do tests maybe move from 15 to 25%? Maybe some might be a little below 15. Well, it's because it's still the average. It might say up to, but Apple isn't going to take one complete outlier where maybe they give you 25%, but like 90% of other tests give you 10 or 15. So they will say it's up to 15. They won't lie here. Apple has in recent years been super duper correct, at least when it comes to mainstream benchmarks. When it comes to like giving you correct uplift data. Like back in the day, for example, when Cinebench was a real bitch test and you saw very little uplift, or you saw uplift that really didn't make sense because it was completely unoptimized for Apple products. Maybe that could skew the average for like some reviewers, but I promise you that Apple, of course, never would use a benchmark that was completely unoptimized, completely unreflective of real-world testing. So that, of course, leaves us with these promises, and they do line up with what we're seeing here. Of course, we do have the improvement in clock speed as well, from 3.77 gigahertz to around 4 gigahertz. They do seem to show that the A18 does perform like 200 to 3, well, it's not 200, 300 megahertz. It's barely any megahertz slower, but it's still a tiny difference.
回到 A17 Pro， 在浮点测试的时候呢，还是有一些轻微的降频，那实际的性能提升幅度大概就是在15%左右。那这个提升幅度就和官方公布的几乎一致。那如果对比 IPC 的话 ，A18 Pro 整数 IPC 比 A17 Pro 高出大概4.5%，浮点高出了9.5%啊，综合呢高出了7%左右。这还是在
Again, this is where I have to like start to questioning averaging those results, because my question is, would the benchmark that maybe increased a lot more, might it be indicative of like the actual test, like the actual tasks that people really use their devices for? I'm not an expert here. It seems like it would. So in that sense, I don't know why, if it makes sense to even average those results, but up to a 10% IPC uplift, an average of 7%, still of course is good, Gen to Gen.
18 Pro 频率更高 ，IPC 衰减更严重的情况。那如果是严格同频的去对比 IPC 的话 ，A18 Pro 还会更强一点。那么普通版的 A18 表现又怎么样呢？其实它的大核跟 A18 Pro 的性能非常的接近啊，基本上差距仅仅来自于缓存配置上的不同。可以说这两兄弟 CPU 的单核性能基本上是一致的。当然，更高的频率也带来了更高的功耗。如果横向对比核心功耗的话 ，A18
This is where I honestly I don't know. Like I cannot tell you if their power consumption metrics are correct. I know they test like with very elaborate like cooling solutions here. I don't know if that might encourage the chip to just consume more power because it thinks it can. Because well, I'm not getting hot, so while I might not even give you more than like 10 megahertz more, let me consume 15% more performance for like 1% more power. Chips can absolutely behave like that. So I don't know. I also don't know if any of their side loading tests result in any problems. Again, spec isn't on the App Store as far as I know or anything. So yeah, again, some methodology questions. Maybe they have like a methodology video on their website for iOS testing, because obviously Android testing should be a lot easier in general. But yeah, for now, I remain a little bit questioning of some of these metrics. There's also just the fact that like the power consumption spike between like the A16 performance core to the A18, like, or even just the A17 performance core is really high. And then here, I don't even know what is the difference between that's integer, that's FP. Okay, so that's the difference. Oh, and then orange is just the power consumption. Okay. So that completes the graph, basically. It's not a new graph or anything.
单核功耗显然是比 A17 Pro 更高的，那这个频点已经是目前手机上最激进的频点了。不过比起 M4 这个峰值4.5G 赫啊，还是要收敛多了。
The M4 does not run at 4.5 gigahertz. It only got to 4.5 gigahertz on their testing, where they put like liquid nitrogen cooling on its back. So again, some dubious stuff to how they get those chips to boost to their absolute max, where it really pushes them outside of their efficiency window, which some people might say, well, the chip does it voluntarily. It's not like they overclocked it. Well, it kind of is when you're literally the only guys on the entire internet who ever got an M4 chip to jump to 4.5 gigahertz inside the M4 iPad Pro. Just saying, this is why I was really hesitant to react to their analysis of the M4 iPad Pro. They've gotten some extra notoriety from having an interview with Johnny Sarugi, who is Apple's chief architect of processors. So that's why I'm kind of inclined to give them a little bit more of a chance. Not even because I believe that, oh, it lends them so much credibility, but because, well, it's also good for my channel, let's be honest.
毕竟哪怕用了同款内核，咱们依然要对手机的这个散热有点逼数啊。那么苹果这颗超大核跟目前安卓阵营主流的 ARM 公版 Cortex X4 核心对比，表现又如何呢？同样是峰值评点下，整数性能的差距大概是42%啊，浮点性能的差距大概是52%啊。苹果的单核依然是当之无愧的王者。
Yeah, so single core performance versus Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is absolutely incomparable. Again, you can argue about if the power consumption metrics are correct or not. Maybe because it's really not clocked very high, it sits more comfortably on in its efficiency window, so that's why it can still stay below 6 watts. I'm highly questioning of the 8 watts power consumption of one single core, because when you consider the power envelope of the M4 iPad Pro, the fact that it has 4 of these cores, one of those at least would be clocked 10% higher than this. I just don't know how it would ever sustain any kind of high performance level if that was the actual power consumption. Battery life would also be complete shit the second you engage in something CPU intensive, which is, by the way, not the case. Like, sometimes I can speculate about those things, and then when I go into actual details, oh, it's actually not the case. It is actually like the case that when you ramp up the CPU, it's really bad for battery life, and usually the CPU just tries to clock a lot lower to sit better on the efficiency curve. But yeah, those results where it goes above 8 watts, my speculation has been in recent times that I believe they are failing to isolate for the power consumption of the board here. But yeah, this idea that it consumes 1/3 more wattage than the Cortex X4, it just doesn't line up with pretty much anything in my view.
这么多年下来，安卓的单核也就刚刚接近 A15 水平而已。
And again, also to anyone who believes that the 8 Gen 4 will jump to 4.3 gigahertz, here are the usual like frequency increases that you see. The 8 Gen 2 jumped by 100 megahertz. The A15 to the A16 jumped by 300 megahertz, so even slightly less. Then another less than 300 megahertz increase from the A16 to the A17 Pro. Then another less than 300 megahertz increase to the A18 family. So if it runs at 4.3 gigahertz, even if it runs on a very different architecture, I know obviously there can be massive differences in like performance at any different clock speed between different architectures. But if you think that these chips, the 8 Gen 4, will not consume a lot more power, you're just delusional. And Jan, my famous male-only German viewer, my only male German viewer, welcome to the stream, brother.
那不过这个峰值表现啊，只是秀肌肉。
By the way, guys, we've been streaming now for about an hour. I do want to encourage you guys, if you haven't yet liked the video and subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Consider sharing out the video to anybody who you think might enjoy it, and please be super engaged in the live chat. I love interacting with you guys, hearing your opinion. Jan, you just got your Series 10 from the store. Saying you're really enjoying it. I'm very glad to hear that. And of course, beyond all that, if you want to support this channel directly, please consider doing so with a super chat or a super sticker, or consider becoming a channel member right here on YouTube, or a supporter over on Patreon.
真正有意义的还是功耗。那咱们来画一下 spec 单核能效曲线好了。哎呀，这 A18 跟 A18 Pro 的单核能效相当给力啊。
Yeah, the efficiency is where it's really impressive. Apparently, the peak power consumption gets high. I don't know if that means that maybe in average like usage, Apple would clock it maybe by like 5% lower and get a lot more efficiency. I also am not quite sure how they would draw a curve. Because technically they only have 2 data points, which would be like the efficiency mode, like the low power mode, which obviously clocks dramatically lower, and then the high performance mode, or the real mode. Obviously, as far as I know, they don't have firmware like BIOS level control to set like the clock speeds of the A18 chips inside the newest iPhones. So drawing an actual curve is a little bit misleading. At best, you're getting kind of 2 points on the graph. You're kind of extrapolating them. But again, if you have a point here and you have a point here, right, you can have a curve that looks like this. You can also have a curve that looks like this, right? So where it basically starts to bottoming out very, very quickly. So it's very, very hard to make extrapolated like analysis from 2 data points.
那这个单核能效提升算是继 A15之后最大的一代了。我们终于可以说
They're saying it's the largest efficiency increase since the A18 series, which is interesting, of course, because the main node jump actually happened between A16 and A17. But seemingly the new architecture and the jump from N3B to N3 is more significant than the jump from whatever the CPU architecture was on the A16 to the A17 and the jump from N4 to N3B.
苹果今年的 CPU 没有挤牙膏。
Okay, Apple's CPU this year has no toothpaste. You heard it here, guys. No toothpaste included with your iPhone. You remember the old times, of course, when you opened up your box, right, and you had your iPhone, you had your charger, which Apple maniacally took away from you. You had your headphones. Back in the original iPhone day, you even had the dock included with the iPhone 2G. But then, of course, who could forget the combination of CPU plus toothpaste, right? Like you had that CPU that, of course, you had to manually push inside the iPhone so you actually could upgrade one generation to the other, but you needed to really use the toothpaste. Half of it you could use to actually lubricate the CPU so it would slide in nicer into your iPhone, and then, of course, you could still use the rest of the toothpaste maybe for next year's iPhone still, or you could, of course, just use it for your teeth because it's toothpaste.
跟安卓阵营比起来，那就更是遥遥领先了。以目前的差距来说啊，今年的8阵4和9400啊，在单核能效上恐怕还是会赶不上 A18。这也难怪。
Yeah. So to anybody who, by the way, just wants to say. That they're jumping from N4P to N3E, so they will have a massive efficiency jump. I would argue the X95 core has a decent chance of having a massive efficiency jump because it doubles literally every cache level inside the chip, L2, L3. But it so happens that like Orion cores then go absolutely crazy on clock speed. Really? Well, have you forgotten the days when you had toothpaste included with your iPhone?
是使用2+4的6核规格了，它这个单核心确实已经非常恐怖了。2颗 P 核的表现超过了预期啊，那么它的 E 核表现又怎样呢？ A18系列的 E 核频率比 A17 Pro 高了不少，来到了2.4 G 核。
Yeah, that's an over 10% clock speed jump. That's of course a lot. The actual power consumption hasn't changed much, which again, I cannot promise you that they tested perfectly, but this would line up with what I believe. So you can take it or leave it. Now, granted, there isn't here a big IPC uplift, seemingly, because the scaling seems to basically come from just the power consumption and the higher clock speeds, of course. But yeah, like the days, of course, of extreme low power on like the A16, A15 might be over. I don't actually know if Apple has frequency control on the efficiency cores where they clock even lower than that. Maybe this is their most optimal operating performance. Because this is when the cache really like lights up nicely. Never forget, of course, that your cache is very much bound in its frequency to your cores. So if you lower frequency too much, you also effectively lower the bandwidth that you have inside the chip. And that, of course, negatively impacts performance, maybe disproportionately so.
提升接近12%的情况下，内核峰值功耗却基本控制在了 A17 Pro 的水平。如果加入安卓阵营的 A720 和 A715，
Yeah, we are getting the A725 this year. One thing that will be very interesting on the A Gen 4 is that the A Gen 4 will be based on the A Gen 4 will be basically only Orion cores, from what I understand. What is the core makeup of the Snapdragon A Gen 4? Can somebody out of their like from the top of their head tell me? Why am I lisping today? Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 cores. So it's a 2 plus 6 cores. Oh, it will be 6 A725 cores at 2 point. What? I thought it was just Orion cores. Did that change? And 6 Orion cores now at 2.78 gigahertz. So what was then that test with Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 Geekbench? So what was then that test that delivered these results? What was the clock speed here? Do they not have a screenshot? Okay, so I apologize. Oh wow, I was wrong here on two ways. For one, the cores are not clocked close to 4.3 gigahertz. I remember seeing this as 4.27, so I guess I was drunk when I saw that with you guys briefly. So it runs at close to 4.4 gigahertz. And then 6 Cortex A725 cores, which would be, so they are still getting some cores officially from ARM. It's running at LPDDR. Wait, what? What? Why is it ARM v9.2? I have not once seen it be ARM v9 thus far. That's expected bullshit. Okay, so this is just made up shit. Like the fact that it's running on Snapdragon on LPDDR5T, which would be like 9600 megatransfers per second memory. Okay, I was duped by this. This is, you cannot trust anything when it comes to these chips online. It's such garbage data. The Snapdragon, like, let's just look here, 2840. So that would line up 4.1 gigahertz and 2.8 gigahertz. But that's, of course, the test that where multicore is more in line with the A18 Pro. ARM, you're saying they're all ARM cores. No. There's a difference between ARM architecture, the broad understanding, and the company ARM. Which does have off-the-shelf individual core designs, which would include like the Cortex X925, the A725, A520, and stuff like that. And then there is the broad ARM architecture, which is you can license just the broad instruction set. That was when we talk about ARM v8 or ARM v9, and that ends up with usually, well, if you just use the very basic instruction set and then build on top of it, that's what Apple does. This is what Qualcomm is now doing with their Orion cores, but seemingly I thought that they are going kind of the X Elite route on the 8 Gen 4, where they would just use downclocked Orion cores as efficiency cores. But yeah, I'm just flabbergasted by these results. Where is the 10,000 result? No, I don't care about Antutu. Antutu doesn't scale with anything anyway. OnePlus 13, that was the test. Oh yeah, so I was correct. So it was running at around 4.3 gigahertz. 6 cores were running at 3.5 gigahertz. This is why I thought they were Orion cores. As far as I understand, the A725 cores don't run at such high clock speeds. Like, I've never seen A720 cores run at that clock speed. Maybe the A725 allows it. But this result is baffling then, because it just goes complete, like, guys, the difference between power consumption of running something at 4 gigahertz and running at almost 4.4, which we saw like this one test at 4.37, you will see like 25% higher power consumption from that, like less than 10% increase, because you are just pushing the chip outside of its comfort zone. So yeah, I will have to say, I probably don't trust trust anything in regard to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 right now. I'll just gonna wait, because even if that is technically possible, I just don't see why you would ever run efficiency cores at 3.6 gigahertz, especially if you have 6 cores. Like maybe if you had 2 efficiency cores and they were really starved for their ability to handle more demanding tasks, but that is just baffling change. A YouTube colon she's saying, I think they tried to control the frequency by changing the simulated thermal condition of the app. That's a very, very imprecise way to do it, if that's the case. Because I know you can change some stuff in Xcode between normal, fair, serious, and critical, but that's not a fully direct frequency response, because obviously your thermals can suffer at 3 gigahertz maximum clock speed if you are in a 35 or 40 degrees Celsius environment, or they can be absolutely fine at 4 gigahertz if you are in like the Swedish tundra at like 5 to minus 5 degrees Celsius, of course. And once it gets to minus 20, now you can basically run any chip at any frequency you would ever want. It just, you wouldn't get actually more performance at some point, because every architecture just stops scaling somewhere. Yeah, so I was so confused here. Like, so I wasn't completely wrong. It's just this bullshit 10,000 point result from supposedly the OnePlus 13 that somehow clocks its efficiency cores at 700 megahertz higher than we thought it would. And clocks its main CPU cores at least 100 to 200 megahertz higher, maybe more. So I'm not surprised that we're getting these results. A725 aren't efficiency cores, though. They're used as ones, though. That's the point. I know that technically the efficiency cores are like the A500 series, but the A700 are like intermediary cores. The problem is that Apple's efficiency cores are so performant, they can actually do serious work on them, and the A500 chips cannot. They are so low power, they are basically or so low performance, actually. Their efficiency isn't even that great, but they're well, they should have some data on that here, right? Well, no, they use the A700 here, but when you use the A500 just is in a completely different performance league, and in that regard, you just cannot compare them to Apple's efficiency cores. And of course, we don't know if Apple's efficiency cores might just drop their frequency by 500-600 megahertz, especially if you utilize like 4 of them, or on DM4, like 6 of them simultaneously, and in that regard, they're pushed even further up in their efficiency. And now the Cortex, of course, here you can see the A720, which is currently kind of the latest gen, does consume about the same, gives you about the same performance as the A18, but like consumes like 50% more performance. Tipamaster saying, a channel called Riva Technology seems to have the first 16 Pro teardown. I've seen teardowns. Oh, by the way, one last teardown thing. That's one thing that I wanted to cover. I told you the battery capacities inside the newest iPhones. With the new teardown, we actually do confirm two things about the batteries. First, the 16 Pro series features a new metal casing. I would like to know which exact metal we are talking about, if it is stainless steel as rumored, or maybe something better thermally conductive like aluminum. And we see that the base 16 models do have what Apple promised, which is they're easier to detach battery, which is basically connected, it can be loosened via low voltage electrical current, such as from a 9-volt battery, and that change has not made its way to the Pro model. So better repairability on the 16 and 16 Plus, higher capacity on all devices, actual new like enclosure technology only on the Pro models. It also seems like whatever they're doing with the metal, it doesn't actually make it too much heavier, or like relatively to the capacity increase. Of course, it is heavier because the capacity has increased, but it doesn't seem to actually negatively impact like density as of the overall package. So that's nice. yeah, that's data I did want to provide to you in the beginning of the video. Thank you so much, TippoMaster, for doing that as well. Let's continue. So, of course, guys, this is why I love interacting with you in the live chat. I love getting your opinions. I love clearing up maybe misunderstandings that exist. It's all very, very interesting to me.
对比的话，这颗小核的性能比较接近2.04 GHz 的 A720内核。
You see, the performance of this small core is closer to the A720 core at the 2.04 gigahertz frequency point. So you would be inclined to think, well, what happens if I push this core down to 2.1 gigahertz, for example, like basically the clock speed of the A17? Do I lose like 12-13% performance? Do I gain maybe in efficiency by maybe reducing power consumption by like 30% or something like that? So again, this is stuff where I just would want, like, I would pay serious money to just go into a TED talk with Joni Cerrucci, and he gives us that actual data, right? An actual frequency power consumption curve on the on both performance and efficiency cores. He gives us the exact architectural underlying changes that resulted in ray tracing improvements. He talks about how system level cache helps certain things scale beyond even just memory bandwidth. I would love that, but unfortunately, it's all secretive, and we do have to rely on guys like Geekerwan, which is nothing against them, but they cannot have the exact same insight, of course, as the company making the actual chip.
此时，如果我们去对比版号的话，它的功耗依然是比近似性能下的 A720低不少的。不过因为内存升级到了 LPDDR5 叉，所以版号呢 A18系列相比较于 A18 Pro 是有小幅升高的。那么考虑到天玑9300啊，就已经抛弃掉了这个 A5 叉叉系列的这个核心啊。A720 核心已经是安卓阵营。
Yeah, by the way, Relay, here you have the answer to your statement, which is that the 700 cores, or in what you said, the 725 aren't efficiency cores. They are efficiency cores de facto because companies are giving more and more up on the A500 cores, which ARM has really been reluctant to update in a decent fashion. This is why I was so surprised at the clock speeds. I just automatically assumed that the 3.6 gigahertz clock speeds of that we saw on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, it just didn't make sense for me for it to be A725 cores, because A720 cores are at 2 gigahertz. It's already a huge jump, even when you consider the Note improvement to go from this to 2.8 gigahertz, but at least it's somewhat believable. But jumping to what is literally 80% higher clock speeds, not 80% more performance through IPC and clock speed gains or whatever, and memory bandwidth improvements, whatever. No, 80% higher clock speeds. We never see that kind of jump. So I would just be, I don't know. I think that at this point, I'm kind of thinking that this test might actually be bullshit in some way, might be just overclocked, or it's not actually A725 based. It actually does have 8 Orion cores, and 6 of them are just gimped, have less cache, whatever, and run at lower frequency. But at this point, I don't even know what to believe. So, but I guess we are not too far away from the official announcement anyway. This is also, by the way, why I'm more careful about talking like the Dimensity 9400. Wait. Do I not have here? Here's the Oppo X Find X8, right? Supposedly running the 90-400 benchmark, 90-400 chip, which does actually line up with what we know. It has one X5 or X925 core at 3.63 gigahertz. Those are, I believe, 3 X4 cores. So those are last generation cores with less cache which would basically be like, oh, it's like this, but gimped anyway. And running at clock speeds that are very similar to current generation, but of course we do have the node improvement that will help those cores be much more energy efficient. That being said, the energy efficiency of X4 was never too great. We saw like we saw statements like N4P based X4 cores are like 45-50% less efficient than the A18 performance cores. So even if N3E helps those cores a little bit, they would still end up being like 30-25% less energy efficient. I think these cores have like this one core, the X925 core, has a much higher chance of actually coming close to Apple's energy efficiency because it's also clocked much lower. It also finally doubles down on cache amount. And then it's cluster 1, which is 4 cores at 2.4 gigahertz. As far as I know, those are actually those are Cortex A720 cores. So it doesn't have the latest cores across the board. So I assume with the A725, you could very conceivably then see 2.8 gigahertz on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 and maybe not even lose too much. But and then of course the multi-core results just come from this one. Essentially has 4 performance cores, so this multi-core result will come with pretty high power consumption. And the reason why they can do so is of course because the cooling systems are pretty overkill on these Oppo flagships. The battery is, I believe, pretty large too. So while of course we could see similar things from Apple Apple does value other things in their devices: premium materials, fantastic speakers, new microphone system as we saw this year. Even like their waterproofing systems is kind of like untouched, like when it comes to the promises that they make. Again, it's all a balance act, but when we talk about the result that we saw from the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, it's just, to me, very unlikely that these will actually be real-world clock speeds. Flock speeds. Flock speeds. It would be if I reverse the F and the C. Let's go YouTube.
目前实质上的一核了。那么 ARM 这个7系列呢，距离苹果的一核这个能效差距还是相当大的。放在能效曲线里呢，基本上就在这个位置。苹果 A18 这个一核呢，算是在之前的基础上稳步提升，维持着 A 系列一贯的水准。总结下 spec 的成绩 ，A18 Pro 依然延续了 A17 Pro 的设计哲学，超强的超大核、激进的频率策略，带来了无敌的单核性能。
Which is interesting because he says it's like radical frequency, which also might be a translation issue. But if the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 comes in at almost 10% higher clock speeds, well, will you criticize them the same way? Also, I wonder, like with Samsung previously, they've talked about like having a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 3 made for Galaxy, so that had like in some ways higher clock speeds. How would you get even higher clock speeds if the OnePlus 13, which I would assume has a default Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 implementation, already pushes you apparently to 8.37 gigahertz? How would you ever try to counter that with a made for Galaxy? Would it literally be like 8.38 gigahertz, or would it just be around 4.38 gigahertz, or maybe around 4.4? Basically a completely imperceptible change that would really fall away to the wayside the second you just have thermal differences. So that would be hilarious to see.
+4核的处理器，要面对的对手可是4+4的发哥和1+5+2的高。
Okay, yeah. So the layup, this is why I was so confused. The X4 obviously does have wait, does it only have one A520 core? Really? Well, that makes sense why people would start ignoring it. Then if it doesn't even make for a good cluster, Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 cores. It's all becoming mush in my brain. It's all becoming mush. specifications. Clock speed up to 3.4 gigahertz, which basically most really top it out at 3.3. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. Yeah, ignore everything but the actual CPU portion, please. Cryo. It doesn't even give you the core count on the official website. Is that real? Is this a joke? What is happening, man? Snapdragon specs and benchmarks and 2 efficiency cores. Wait, what? 1 Cortex X4 at 3.3, 3 Cortex A720 at 3.1 gigahertz, and 2 Cortex A720 at what? The actual F is so it has 5 A720 cores, but they are clocked very differently. Are those the actual results? Does it actually clock that high? Did I miss that somehow? Do their efficiency cores go beyond? They just said, look here. Like, I actually agree here with them where they said, like, oh, the 8 Gen 3, the Cortex A720. Now, those are the lower clocked ones, so there should still be the 2.4 gigahertz ones. But I never thought they are 3.2. And, oh my God, what is going on here? Why is the data so confusing? So, Android... Here's the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 by Galaxy, delivering a little lower than 2200. Doesn't give you a clock speed, but the worst ones apparently run at 2.2 gigahertz. So not at like 2.9. So this is those are the Cortex A520. So do the A720 cores really clock that high? Man, I'm so effed by all of this. 1 + 5 + 2, yes. Okay, so I do trust these guys. So 3 Cortex okay, so if the Cortex 720 can run it up to 3.1, almost 3.2 gigahertz, then I guess maybe the 725 can run at 3.6 gigahertz, but now I don't quite understand what they're talking about with their clock speed. Like on Geekerwan, what's up with that data? Did they manually put it into a clock speed thing that is very different? Yeah, I understand they're mid-cores. I understand it, but look at the clock speed that they have found it on here, right? A little over 2 gigahertz. Did they mess it up? Did they forget 1 gigahertz here? Was it just a copy paste error from? But even then, the A715 still, I believe in that case, would then clock higher. Is that wrong data in the Geekerwan video? Or am I crazy? Because I remember the A720 definitely having at least 2.4 gigahertz from everything that I have seen. Now it seemingly also went up to 3.2 gigahertz. So I'm really, really confused here why they're advertising it at this incredibly low clock speed, which also would kind of explain the power consumption being in line with Apple's efficiency cores. Realizing with winter coming, Qualcomm giving us hand warmer phones. Yeah, definitely. For those final results in the 10,000 range, but at least that now makes a little bit more sense because the Orion clock speeds make some sense when you consider that, of course, we already have Orion cores on N4P being at around 4.2 gigahertz on the Snapdragon X Elite. And then if the A725 can clock at 3.6 gigahertz versus 3.2, which really wouldn't still be a very smart decision, but at least it makes way more sense than 80% higher clock speeds than what they advertise here. So I'm just baffled if their data is wrong or if I'm just stupid. I think I'm really getting confused by their data.
以这次呢，我们 iPhone 的测试看它的多核1+5+2的高通啊。 今年高通可能还要进一步加大核心规模，那苹果这个单核遥遥领先，多核呢可就真不好说了。 要不咱们现在就来看看它的多核表现究竟如何吧。欢迎来到赛博斗蛐蛐环节啊！在开始测试之前，要说明一下，这次呢，我们 iPhone 的测试成绩全部基于 iOS 18.0正式版进行。那么 iOS 18为了优化续航表现，对处理器的 boost 机制做了一些调整，它会让处理器的 boost 稍微延迟一点，再跑到最高频。这样呢，在实际应用里可以更省。
Yeah, I've seen statements about that. I don't know if it's true. Quite honestly, I've seen that promise. If true, and it doesn't impact real-world results, and it only helps you further improve like stability, I'm very, very happy about that choice. That being said, I have not actually seen I have never seen 7800 results on my iPhone 15 Pro Max. They have always been in the 7500 range. And I've never seen results in the 3000s. I've only ever seen results in the 2.9. So my suspicion here is actually, this is actually something that I might want to like really remember. I wonder if they blocked something that they took advantage of with extreme cooling, right? If maybe that behavior was really reserved for like super cool scenarios and basically never came into play for regular usage, like in around like a 20 degrees Celsius room. And maybe whatever like Geekerwan was doing to push like performance to these levels that you will never see while just holding your device in your hand, I wonder if Apple basically fixed that. That is my suspicion, that it might not be a change that impacts iOS 18 overall or whatever. I think it might just be a change to how they test, like that it might be, or like not to them specifically, but just to these extreme scenarios where Apple might have allowed the chip to boost. Well, by the way, boosting a little later doesn't really change max boost speeds. Like, so I'm a little bit, yeah, results are for Canada. So I guess I'll have to stay noise and not be too unfriendly. Was that Canadian accent? I have no idea. But yeah, like maybe that's the case here. I just would be very surprised. Like, I don't know, like this downgrade to me doesn't exist because I never had those results. And whenever I ran iOS 18 or 18.1 benchmarks on my 15 Pro Max, I never saw a decrease from like 70, well, to me it's more like 73, 7400 down to like 7200. So that would be like a percentage-wise similar decrease. Like, let me know if you see those changes on your devices, but I certainly have not seen it any time recently. And I've done a lot of benchmarks, of course, going from like A17 to iOS 18 to iOS 18.1. So I'm just very surprised at these findings.
都不到1秒的 Geekbench 来说，成绩会显著低于 iOS 17。你会看到老款 iPhone 的测试成绩都比我们去年测的有所降低。那这个呢是新系统对跑分软件的 debuff。毕竟苹果的芯片大佬都说了
，fun that the word debuff is apparently in the Chinese language.
那这种情况呢也就见怪不怪。
It's no surprise that this situation is not surprising. Nice. And also, by the way, I said that we do have results with the A18 Pro that are this high. Like most results that I see are like in the 85, 8600 range. So I do wonder where they might have gotten it to overclock a little bit. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 technically is capable of giving you 7300. Again, most results that I know are from devices that will usually give you about 7000. I know you can get it to 7500, but that's really, really like unrealistic and almost impossible to replicate. They're also using the Xiaomi 14 Pro, which isn't even like the best cooled system out there. So I'm really surprised. And this is the overclocked 9300 Plus. This one just consumes power like an MFer. It sits completely outside the efficiency window. It's really a pointless. This is a pointless exercise in boosting clock speeds for benchmarking reasons because it is just so unrealistic. You consume so much more power for these very small boosts. But MediaTek still decided to basically give you that option.
A18 Pro 相比较于 A17 Pro 的单核强了超过19%，突破3400分。那多核8840分的成绩也强了18%，威力惊人啊！和安卓比起来，单核真的是遥遥领先啊。多核呢也轻松干掉了8阵3和天玑9300，而阉割了缓存的普通 A18 同样不甘示弱啊。8705分的成绩并没有比 A18 Pro 差多少。那我们再来看一下多核能效曲线 ，A18 Pro 这次的能效是真的夸张啊，比起 A17 Pro 有明显的改善，峰值功耗甚至比 A17 Pro 还低了一点，性能却高出了很多。低频能效呢也略微有所进步。
I still doubt if their A17 Pro results are correct because they just. Like, given the cooling limitations inside the iPhone, it just really wouldn't make too much sense that it would ever even be able to hit those high multi-core power consumptions. So maybe that comes with the same thing where those results where they pushed it to 7700, which I really haven't seen in real-world tests ever. So maybe that's where it comes from. And even their 7500 results, I still would doubt them to a degree.
存的 A18 低频能效稍差一点点，但兄弟俩整体还是非常接近的，他们都远远强于安卓端的9300加和8阵3。那么今年这个能效啊，可以说确实挺猛的。不过苹果的处理器之所以在 Geekerbench 6里如此之强啊，一部分呢也要归因于 A18 的新架构
Here comes bitching about SME inclusion。
而此前 GB6 呢已经通过更新支持了 SME。那在 M4 那回呢，我们已经讲过了，临时加入新的指令集支持。对于老平台来说，其实是有点不公平的。这相当于是考试考一半，把 T 给改了嘛。
It's not. You like actual tests change. Yes, if you were in 5th grade, the tests in 6th grade will actually be different. This is like new processors need new benchmarks. Like, just because Geekbench 5 is old doesn't make it more objective.
因为 Geekerbench 6的调度策略更接近实际应用，它会让所有的核一起合作。
You see?
因为 Geekerbench 6的调度策略更接近。
Wait, GB6 scheduling strategy is closer to practical applications. So why would we still need GB5 at all?
它会让所有的核一起合作去跑同一个任务，所以核心数量越多，性能损失就越大。那苹果这种少核但是单核性能非常强的策略，就是比较占优的。要不我们也来看看更传统的 Geekbench 5表现怎么样。
Again, Geekbench 5 is not more traditional. It's older. I hate it. This is the same bullshit when companies still keep bringing up like Cinebench R23. Guys, like reviewers are not bringing up Cinebench R23 because they believe it's so much better or so much truer. They're bringing it up because they still have it in like they want to add an extra cheap benchmark to their videos and something they know is somewhat respected. So that's why they do it.
那么在 Geekbench 5里呢 ，A18 系列的2颗处理器，相较于 A17 Pro 的单核和多核提升，都是大约12%到13%的程度啊，比起 Spec 和 Geekbench 6呢要稍微小一点。那么 A18 和 A18 Pro 依然是没什么差距的。论单核的话，哪怕在 Geekbench 5里，这2颗 A18也是依然远远领先于安卓阵营啊。但到了多核测试里，情况就不太一样了。天玑9300加凭借着4个超大核，再加上4个大核的堆核战术，继续霸榜多核测试。即便是 A18 Pro 也难以撼动。Geekbench 5毕竟可以让每个核心都跑满，这种彻底榨干多核的测试就只能靠堆核来取胜了。不过，当我们再来聊能效曲线的时候，苹果就又占据了话语权啊！哪怕在只有6核的情况下，2款 A18的 Geekbench 5能效依然打赢了天玑9300加。当然，优势虽然没有 Geekbench 6那么大，但表现也还是不错。2款 A18相比较于
Okay, it's interesting. So they don't draw curves for the A18 chips, I guess because they don't have data for in between.
低频部分也是继续保持领先。有一说一啊，A18 Pro 的峰值功耗居然相比较于 A17 Pro 更低啊，这也是我之前完全没有预料到的。那么 Spec 和 Geekbench 的测试做完呢，感觉 A18 Pro 的 CPU 进步比我预期的还要大。那不管是峰值性能还是能耗表现
This is by the way one brief thing I just wanted to mention that I don't know why, but whenever I listen to them, it sounds to me like they always expect Apple to like underperform. They make sometimes weirdly aggressive statements on how bad a new chip is or something like that. I believe they said, oh, it's actually good, like the A18 chip. It's like, of course it's actually good. All of Apple's last chips have actually been good. So I don't know. This is one thing about the Geekerwan that maybe it's a little bit lost in translation, but I definitely didn't like the basic tone in the A17 Pro review either. I think they were really like, oh, we expected so much more from N3, and I'm like, well, what would you know like about N3B versus N4 at that point? It's like, just take what you get in that regard. Like, if it's still better, it's still better, and it's a 1 year improvement, right? So for example, I can understand why some people would be disappointed with Zen 5 versus Zen 4. It's not because Zen 5 is bad, it's because Zen 4 is 2 years old and gives you basically the same performance, maybe minus 5%, at best 10%. That's very small for your 2 year gap, especially considering that the new chips aren't really like dramatically cheaper now that Zen 4 has been on the market for a little bit, has seen some price discounts. But like these are just like from A16, for example, to A18. That's a really huge jump. From A14 to A16, it was a big jump. From A12 to A14, it was a big jump, and so on and so forth.
A17 Pro 拉开了显著的代差。甚至可以说啊，它是苹果在 A15 推出之后多年挤压高之后啊
，it is Apple,
进化幅度最大的一代。这就让我非常期待啊，这代 iPhone 的游戏性能和续航表现了。
Okay,
那在这之前，咱们先来看看 GPU 的表现。
Okay, GPU.
那么今年呢
Which, by the way, this is one thing I don't like when they're like, oh, I want to see gaming tests, but before that, let's look at the GPU. I'm like, what? What do you think games test?
Benchmark 推出了全新的跨平台测试工具 Steel Nomad Lite。那这个 Benchmark 使用了不少新的特性啊，比起古老的 GFX Bench 更能够准确的反映现代
GFX Bench should not be used in any way.
我们 SoC PK 上的 GPU 能效曲线也已经更新到了 Steel Nomad Lite。但这个测试工具的高压力呢，也带来了一个问题啊，就是它要求你的手机必须有至少8G 内存才能。
Yes, that's fine. Like, new tests come with different things. You can say, by the way, yeah, we can only compare it now to the A17 Pro. Get effed, A16 users. Yes, that is fair. That is how real life works. Bringing up ancient benchmarks that don't scale well is not good data because the new test with actual good data might be limited by memory. That is just true.
所以呢 ，A16和之前的老 iPhone 压根儿就跑不了啊！谁让苹果的内存跟金子一样贵呢？那么在这个测试里啊，我们就只能对比 A17 Pro、骁龙8 Gen 3和天玑9300了。那么在 SNL 能效曲线里 ，A18 Pro 的表现估计还行。
Okay, this is where we get into territory that to me is absolutely laughable, and that is GPU power consumption. I have no idea how they measure it. I have no idea if they actually manage to isolate GPU power consumption from the overall board power consumption, but I can guarantee you the A18 Pro is not using 12 watts. Like, the reason we know that is because we know in games the entire SoC will use like 5 or 6 watts. How the actual F do you get the GPU by itself to consume 12 watts? Well, it's easy. You can have momentary spikes of such intensity. That's absolutely normal. We've discussed this in the past. This is, for example, why the RTX 4090 is technically a 450-watt GPU, even though a lot of times it might actually run just fine, even below 400 watts or even around 350 watts. But even though it does that, it also can have momentary spikes almost in the 600-watt range, or at least over 500, right? Those spikes don't matter really. They aren't data. They are fluctuations. It's similar to how when you exert your body, yes, you do have a certain amount of pressure you can apply and stuff like that. There's a certain amount of tension that your muscles create internally, but changing the angle ever so slightly in between will change it actually drastically, lower it, increase it, but it's not something you will actually be able to sustain in the same way. This idea that A18 Pro consumes 12 watts of power, like while actual, like, and this is supposedly just a GPU test, so it's either extremely light on the CPU or basically imperceptible. I assume it still has some impact, of course, because running frames still is as a task is something coming from the CPU, the actual instruction. But I guarantee you, it's not using 12 watts. This is where I really have issue with their methodology. When I don't even know where is the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 that is notorious for using like 30% higher wattage in actual games than the iPhone, like supposedly sits at 1/3 less power in just GPU tests. Even though, by the way, Apple's GPU architecture is notorious for being one of the most efficient on desktop. Like when you compare like what even the M3 is capable of, which supposedly is running on the not so efficient M3B node. Or even back in the day when M1 came out, and even now up to now, like an RDNA 3.5 internal GPU that is based on technically a newer node like N4 or N4P in like the latest or even second latest AMD APUs will have trouble giving you the same GPU efficiency as Apple's old M1 on the original 5nm node. So you either tell me that, well, the Dimensity 9300 is not too great here, but it is still better supposedly. So either you're telling me that the Adreno GPU cores inside the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 are just magically more efficient, or you're telling like than everything else in the industry, by the way, which by the way is not the case. You know why we know that? Because whatever architecture Qualcomm ported to the Snapdragon X Elite is not very energy efficient, and it loses by a mile to the half power consumption using M4. So I don't believe this actually for even a second. This to me is not error data or anything like that. To me, this is like sometimes a data point might have like an error or like one single error point or something like that. No, this to me is completely wrong. My speculation is that they are measuring data like power consumption spikes rather than actual sustained power consumption, which in my opinion would probably put the A18 Pro maybe at peak GPU power consumption at around 7-8 watts, which would make sense that then a spike would be 50-60% higher, and then of course once it's like thermally saturated, maybe it drops down to 6 watts. That is how I perceive it. And again, they do call it the GPU test, so I assume they are only testing like the power consumption of the actual GPU.
GPU 的峰值呢，相比较于 A17 Pro 高出了18%的性能，不过功耗也要更高，整体能效没有像它的 CPU 提升那么大，但还是有一定进步的。尤其是 GPU 的低频能效似乎还不错，比起两位安卓对手在能效上也是要强一些的。普通 A18尽管少一个 GPU 核心啊，但看起来对于能效的影响也不大。那么 A18的这个残血 GPU 呢，能效依然强过 A17 Pro， 也强于9300加和8阵3。考虑到 GPU 的架构没有太大的变化，这里的一个重要工程是内存带宽的增大。确实，之前的6400频率的内存呢，还是会影响 GPU 发挥的。那这次内存呢加到了7500频率，再加上其他各种各样的改进啊， 总算把原来应有的实力解放出来了。反正架构不大改，我们也很难再看到像从 A14到 A15那样的进化幅度。那么 GPU 的小幅进步，再加上前面我们说的 CPU 的大幅进步啊，就让我有点好奇这一代的 iPhone 游戏表现究竟如何。那么我们就先从老朋友《原神》开始吧。回到常规的25度30分钟测试，对于现在的这些旗舰 SoC 来说，已经不再是一个高难度的测试项目了。
I mean, doesn't Genshin Impact has a 120 FPS mode that you could test? That would be a very interesting SoC test. Also, why are you running at 5G?
我决定直接从30度
The reason, by the way, I'm not saying that 5G is unrealistic, because obviously, like if you're playing Genshin Impact outside, you're using it with 5G. I know that some regions might actually have better cellular data than they have like Wi-Fi connectivity. But to me, this idea of like, oh, like even the iPhone, for example, now the Pro models use the same X75 modem that the latest Qualcomm-based devices do, right? But that still, like the iPhone might still perform notably better in actual like connectivity, right? Might catch a signal 2 meters earlier, or it might perform at the same distance with 10-15% higher speeds or something like that. So this idea that like, oh, they're both 5G, so it's equilibrial in terms of usage, that's not true. Just use it on freaking Wi-Fi and use it on close connection. Yes, that will still be subject to differences in modems, but far less impacted by like actual antenna performance, or for example by how close the 5G modem is to your actual SoC. Or at least give us both data points, because this is one of those tests where it's clearly like, oh, having one data point might be worse than having no data point, because it might be very misleading. But having 2 data points that could compare and contrast with each other would actually be very advantageous.
测试开始，毕竟你们都知道，这个项目对于曾经的 iPhone 来说简直就是噩梦啊。那么既然苹果说这代的散热有提升，我倒是要来看看它能不能撑得住5G 高温游戏的考验。结果你猜怎么着？还真的有点离谱啊！在30度5G 的虚拟跑图测试当中，这一代的 iPhone 16 Pro Max 居然跑出了55.5帧的平均帧啊！这真的还是我熟悉的那个 iPhone 吗？这个
I mean, like 55 versus 48 is a nice generational uplift of 10% of averages. Now, I know the averages are slightly impacted by the fact that 60 is still a hard lock, which is really bad way to test. And you could argue that, or at least it doesn't have those very clear drops. But
也打平了使用天玑9300加散热2
oh my god
好的 vivo X100S， 并且大幅领先于更了最新系统的小米14 Pro。
Okay, so the Xiaomi 14 Pro performs worse. This is why, by the way, I don't believe their power consumption metrics, because the Xiaomi 14 Pro, according to their testing, is far better cooled, but somehow cannot sustain the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 performance. Okay, which I guess this would actually like run true with devices like the Galaxy S24 Ultra, which if you look like channels like Dame Tech, which I wonder if he has done like a new benchmark already, have shown that it can sometimes give you half the real world performance of the A17 Pro chip. My god, can you please get out to the way so I can see everything? Jesus Christ, I hate subtitles. So the A15, 33 FPS, you would probably want to play it at just a 30 FPS lock. A16 would be great if they had the 40 FPS lock. Then these games, you would probably just want to rely on VRR. And yeah, so again, to me, this data point alone just shows just the chip alone. Like, how does it make sense that supposedly you can get the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 to basically max out at 60 FPS, but then a device that is still supposedly so much better cooled than the iPhone then can also underperform at this point like a 3 Gen old iPhone or 2 Gen old iPhone.
不过机身比较小的 iPhone 16
Subtitles, we need them again.
Pro 就没有那么给力了，它在5G原神里的表现甚至还不如上代的 iPhone 15 Pro， 反而是配置低一档的 iPhone 16表现还不错。
I mean, yeah, but there's no device like the small 16 Pro here with the other tests.
3帧也算是比较流畅了。那机身温度方面呢，新 iPhone 似乎最热点比起上代都有所降低啊。那么5G 游戏46度多，基本上是和安卓旗舰控制差不多。那么对于 Pro Max 来说，确实是做到了帧率更高。
Okay, so 16 Pro Max, 46.8. Which is 0.7 degrees cooler here. Seems to also dissipate the heat a little better. And then we also saw it has better performance. But it's not like monumental change. Like you can definitely see that the saturation here is better. But if the Xiaomi 14 Pro is supposedly so much better cooled, has a system that spreads out its heat so efficiently, then my question is, how does it end up performing worse than this iPhone? Like that to me is just mind-boggling. And this is where I say that they're like real-world results, which, for example, I'm fully capable of acknowledging that like a super cool, like almost like gaming phone device, maybe even the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 outperforms the A18 Pro and the A17 Pro, of course, therefore. But when you clearly have such outliers, it becomes so much more than about just the processor.
温度更低啊，5G 测试必须插线啊，所以我们没有记录到功耗。那么接下来的崩坏星穹铁道里，我们就来看看能效吧。那这次呢，我们为了好好照顾这些旗舰 SoC 啊，我们
that's the sister game to Genshin Impact basically, Honkai Star Rail.
升级了崩铁的测试场景，从之前的仙州罗浮更换到了压力显著更大的匹诺康尼黄金的时刻。这下应该没有任何手机能跑满60帧了，太棒了！你看看这如同心电图一般的帧数曲线，真是酸爽啊。
By the way, as somebody who works with electrocardiograms, this does not look like an electrocardiogram.
在匹诺康尼的测试当中 ，iPhone 16全系
And also something that needs to be considered, the iPhone does run at higher resolutions, the A18 series at the very least. So I don't know if there are any. I have heard that there are settings differences in Genshin Impact, of course, that do impact. That might actually run higher on iPhone than they ever do on Android, even on Ultra. But I cannot tell you that. I will leave that to some other testers. There is also another test that unfortunately I don't see run often. Genshin Impact Metal FX upscaling, which I believe they've added that, right? Recently added Apple's upscaler, which is AI-based. They use their neural engine here, which of course the A&E here is also improved on the A18 Pro versus the A17 Pro. So again, this is a missing data point because it's kind of like not acknowledging the existence of DLSS when you're reviewing an NVIDIA card. I don't know how many games have actually optimized it, but like 1 year ago, basically, when it came out, it was like basically universally praised for being pretty good. And in fact, like many YouTube channels and so have said the same thing.
都要高于先前的15系列，也高于安卓。哪怕在分辨率更高的情况下 ，iPhone 16 Pro Max 还是表现出色，依然以49.7帧的平均帧。
So I've actually calculated we are looking only at a small difference at like 1.3 megapixels essentially versus 1.2. So this is where it gets really crazy though, because this is where you need to put the 8 Gen 3 to actually overperform the iPhone. And even the they don't have, here's the A17 Pro, right? So at 4.8 watts, it gives you higher performance than the 8 Gen 3 does at 6.2 watts. This is obviously does include like the overall SoC. It does run here on a slightly lower resolution, so maybe you could argue those chips are pretty close. But when you actually want to overperform it, it's 8 watts. And those are such stark differences where I almost wonder, like, would you really use those settings at that point? Like, I would be, for example, very interested in basically a 60 fps frame locked mode where maybe you adjust resolution 20, 25, 30% lower and then see the power consumption. Or you just completely decouple us from any bonds and get rid of the 60 fps lock and see how that impacts the averages, potentially power consumption too, because that then also has an impact on CPU, because obviously it's now rendering more frames. So it's just, I don't know. I really, I for some reason really don't like that data. Even like, and it has nothing to do whether or not the iPhone wins or not, because the iPhone wins. I don't care about tests where the power consumption is 8 watts, because at no point in time do I ever want my smartphone to consume 8 watts. Right? That's just too much. It just will eat up even the largest battery super duper quickly. So I'm just a little like baffled, honestly, by some of this here. Guys, we've been streaming now for almost 2 hours. I do want to wrap it up a little bit over the next half hour. So last shout out to do, second to last shout out to do all the YouTube jazz, as we call it. Subscribing, liking, sharing, of course, commenting. I love interacting with you. And beyond all that, please consider donating in the form of a super chat or a super sticker, or becoming a channel member to support this channel long term, or becoming a supporter over on Patreon.
搭载天玑9003加的 X100S， 并且5.2瓦的整机功耗也比 X100S 和小米14 Pro 低不少。那苹果的游戏能效呢，依然非常有优势。其他3款新 iPhone 也在更高的分辨率下跑到了比较流畅的帧率，而且除了 iPhone 16 Pro 以外的其他几款 iPhone 平均解热功耗都有5瓦甚至更高啊。
Like, by the way, this power consumption of 4.5 watts, ideally, this is where I would actually want power consumptions to be. If anybody knows, like, for example, the Nintendo Switch 2 is supposedly like targeting like a super duper low power consumption in mobile mode, so when not connected to the dock. Maybe that would be somewhat indicative of that, but this is actually like the watts. Like, I know obviously you can have a very large cooling system. I know you can have a very large battery inside, but in the end, you have to still consider the 16 Pro here is a 6.3-inch device. It's a device with still incredibly small bezels, so it's just monumentally smaller than like these Android counterparts. It's just again, I believe that Apple targets 5 watts maybe partially because of cooling, but I fundamentally believe that's because Apple just thinks that in terms of like relation to the overall battery that you want to put in, if you actually put in 10% higher capacity, you don't want your device to then automatically consume 15% more power. You want it to actually last potentially 10-15% longer. Tipper Master, isn't it the Star Rail idle music? I don't know. Speaking of, I'd like to see a test on if throttling on that is completely gone with the new thermals, say 15 to 20 minutes. Well, they do say they test at 25 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. So I assume if maybe you're more talking about 20 degrees and have the running time, right, maybe there it's gone. But I would also, by the way, say, like, throttling is such a difficult thing to say, because if you adjust the settings a little bit, right, if you put it maybe on medium graphical settings, or you reduce the resolution to just a cool 720 or something like that, right, which would scale, or even like 640, right, and suddenly you can run the game locked at 60 FPS, you bother the CPU less because there are less unpredictable frame rate spikes. You bother the GPU less because now you might only be utilizing like 90% of the GPU, and now you can actually enjoy your game, right? This is why I always say, to me, for one, I don't play much on my iPhone. When I play like more intense mobile games, I play them on my iPad, and when I play quote-unquote real games, I play them on my PlayStation. But I would never try to play it in a mode that is so clearly not still reaching 60 FPS. Tippermas saying, though I wasn't paying full attention. Yeah, I have problems sticking to every little bit of detail. Of course, there's the language barrier, but also the questions that I have for like the different clock speeds of like the efficiency cores that didn't line up with reality to me. Of course, I had other questions to like of like peak GPU power consumption, which again, this is an SoC power consumption level test. The entire SoC, that's both GPU and CPU, consumes 5 watts. I assume, is this the entire board power, or is that just the A18 chip, right? And somehow this chip that is optimized to just run at 5 watts gives you 12 watts just for the GPU portion? That just doesn't make sense. That is like, you know how the M3 uses like up to 22 watts. Maybe as a package, it could go up to 30 if you combine CPU plus GPU, but that's very, very unlikely. Usually you would have the CPU max out at like 18 watts. The GPU would probably only be at 13, 15 watts. But imagine if you had the CPU M4, which like ran at M3, which we know runs at like 18 to 22 watts, and somehow the GPU then starts running at 40 watts. That's essentially what they're trying to tell us here. So I still am not a fan of their, like, I still have no idea how they analyze those individual data points, because their artificial benchmarks stand in stark contrast with their benchmarks, because you could argue, oh, the CPU is just so much more efficient on the iPhone than on the other devices, so that brings power down. But I'm like, wait, but none of these power levels still coincide with those peak GPU power consumption levels. At that point, if you literally never reach like what on the iPhone was 12 watts, or even on the Dimensity 9300, I believe their GPU rating was around 10 watts, right? If no game where you combine the CPU, the GPU, whatever, ever runs at those actual like wattage levels, at what point do you then ask yourself, oh my god, maybe that those previous power consumption metrics that we gave are just complete baloney?
16 Pro 的解热功耗却只有4.5瓦，甚至比前代还要更低啊。那机身温度呢，也要低于其他参测的 iPhone。我不知道是不是目前版本的 iOS 在这台机器上的温控策略有一些异常啊。那查看机身的热成像图呢，你其实可以看得出来，这台 iPhone 的热量分布其实比之前的 iPhone 要均匀很多。那说明这次的散热确实是有。
By the way, this doesn't look like a thermally soaked 16 Pro Max. Like, why does it look so? Yeah, maybe it's just the color contrast that it just gets hot in one spot, but then the A18 Pro on the smaller model seemingly spreads its heat so much better. No idea.
改进的。那下一个游戏，咱们来试试绝区0啊。
No idea what the game
CPU
is.
要求极高的游戏，并且同样开最高画质。
So the iPhone runs at significantly higher resolutions here, because we have 10% improvements on each axis. That means it runs at over 20% higher resolution here, just for you to consider.
似乎要比安卓阵营高出很多，但这也并没有难倒 A18 Pro 啊。两台 iPhone 16 Pro 都能够跑到平均。
I just want you to consider just what is happening in this benchmark, and then try to contrast that with the results we see. Now, let's just say the A Gen 3 and the 9S Pro just completely pushes it to a full 60 FPS. Maybe here you run at 60 and then occasionally drop into like the 55 zone, and then over the length of that benchmark that creates this one frame downgrade, right? Now you have this 7 watts versus 5.5 or even 5 watts, because apparently performance here is the same. And apparently there isn't much of a downgrade here. But somehow the iPhone runs at 20, like basically at the same frame rate or much higher frame rate, while running at 20% higher resolution, while consuming at least 20% less power, or even like 30% less power. Do you now understand why their artificial benchmarks have absolutely no bearing on what we are seeing right now? Like, this just looks like the testing of completely different devices. And by the way, let me just give you an exact count. So that's 728 times 797. So, sorry, I added one wrong thing. So that's 1.377 million pixels, I guess. Or I should have copied it, but doesn't matter. 1568 times 705 is 1.105. So we copy that. So 1.377 divided by the result. So that's 25% higher resolution that the iPhone runs at, and it manages to either beat the A Gen 3 if you want to take the supposedly also greatly cool Xiaomi 14 Pro, and it does so by using a full watt less.
又强出了一大截。能效方面，两台
And
Pro
the A17 Pro model, by the way, still consider this runs at 25% higher resolution, and it still beats the A Gen 3 in the Xiaomi 14 Pro. Yes, we can look at the 9S Pro here, but these are valuable data points that should be put in an actual curve, not the data points that they got from artificial benchmarks with a completely unrealistic power consumption spike.
哪怕在分辨率更高的情况下，功耗也依然比安卓旗舰低不少。那相比之下呢 ，A18 的标准版机型在这里的表现会比较接近上代的 Pro 机型。最后啊，我们也测试了优化极为感人的明朝。
It was very touching.
1.2版本的明朝提升了渲染分辨率，这下压力更高了。那么在明朝的1.2版本的明朝提。
Okay. Wait. What? Oh, so in the larger models, it just uses a higher resolution, but why is it lower in the 15 Pro Max? Guess it just doesn't want to overwhelm it. Okay, I mean, that's still a larger resolution. It's not as big of a difference. I'm going to go again, 1705 times 768. That's 1.309. And then 1600 times 720. That's 1.152. So my God, why am I doing this in Spotlight Search? So that's 13% higher resolution, almost 14% higher resolution. And let's see the result.
渲染分辨率，这下压力更高了。那么在明朝的战斗场景中 ，iPhone 16 Pro Max 再次表现惊艳啊，在分辨率更高的。
So the Pro Max about matches the 9S Pro's 57 FPS. Despite running at 13% higher resolution, while consuming 3 watts less, which if we look at like let's say that small frame rate gap and the resolution just completely level each other out, right? So of course 8.4 divided by 5.4, that leaves us with 55% higher power consumption, basically 56%. Once you consider all the rest, it results in arguably like 70% lower efficiency on whatever this chip is doing. I would never want my chip to do this. That being said, this performance level, I would also say, is pretty unacceptable given 6.2 watts. but there is a small resolution difference on the A17 Pro. That, given that, of course, it runs at 18% higher frame rates while using dramatically low power too. So again, the efficiency calculation of these benchmarks to me is just baffling when you consider what they said prior, where they said like, oh, the iPhone is like a lot better in CPU, a little better in GPU. It's like, no, it's definitely not a little better in GPU efficiency.
情况下做到了56.3帧的平均帧，远远超过了其他所有参测的手机。功耗呢，此时却仅控制在5.4瓦，而且两款使用 A18 标准版的新机型表现也不错。和安卓旗舰比起来 ，iPhone 在明朝里的优势似乎格外的大啊。这个游戏要比米哈游的那几个游戏呢要更偏向于 iPhone， 但 iPhone 16 Pro 在这里好像又出现了温控问题，调度比其他几位怂很多。去年那个小
Okay, I don't know if anything of that is maybe wrongly translated, like what he would mean with scheduling.
反过来了。 希望这只是一个能够通过 OTA 修复的 bug 吧。那总结一下游戏部分的表现啊，搭载 A18 Pro 的两款机型里，凭借着能效提升和散热升级 ，iPhone 16 Pro Max 非常的强啊，它的持续性能甚至可以媲美一些专门的游戏手机，同时功耗却远远低于安卓旗舰。但 iPhone 16 Pro 呢，似乎有一些固件问题，性能释放并不够好。 但两款标准版的 iPhone 16
I mean, no, it's a much smaller device with a smaller battery. You want it to use less performance. It runs at low resolutions. Most of the times, you can see here, you should probably adjust settings even a little bit more. That's the nature of using smaller devices.
表现居然还挺让人惊喜的。那这应该是继 iPhone 13之后标准版性能最接近 Pro 版的一次。 可惜啊，就差一个高刷，不然这绝对是今年最香的
The most fragrant iPhone this year. It smells of toothpaste. It isn't in the box anymore.
能效啊，我觉得大家最关心的还是这代 iPhone 的续航吧。我还依稀记得当年 iPhone 13 Pro Max 借助强大的 A15，把 iPhone 的续航表现直接拉高了一个档次啊。这次新的 iPhone 16系列全系加大了电池容量。 而且 A18 的能效呢也有目共睹。
Well, don't forget the 13 Pro Max also had a noticeably larger battery capacity than the 12 Pro Max. Just so that we are clear here, 12 Pro Max battery capacity, which I believe was under 4,000 milliampere hours, right? It was at 3,700 basically, and the 13 Pro Max was then the first iPhone to go close to 4,400. So it basically was almost 20% higher in terms of battery capacity. So 4,352. Divided by 3,687. It's 18% higher battery capacity. So this idea that the 15 Pro Max increased battery life because of the A15 chip, that is flat out wrong. It literally had one of the largest battery increases ever since like the iPhone 6 series, like where the 6 Plus ended up with almost double, of course, the battery capacity of the iPhone 5S. That is misleading as fuck. The A15 wasn't, it was more efficient than the A14, but not by that much. What is he talking about? This is like factually incorrect.
iOS 18也做了针对续航的优化，那么新 iPhone 会不会很给力呢？从测试结果来看，还真的是相当不错。iPhone 16 Pro Max 和 Plus 两款大机型的续航成绩已经突破了10小时的大关 ，Pro Max 甚至跑出了接近10个半小时的续航成绩啊
！I don't know what the parameters are, unfortunately, for those tests. The capacities are correct. They do line up with what we just got from the news report that I showed you early in the stream. The Xiaomi 14 Pro, of course, technically has a larger battery than even the 16 Pro Max. And then the Vivo X100S here with the 9300 Plus, of course, being at over 5,000 milliampere hours. What is the promise of the Vivo X200? Oh, I assume there's also a difference between Pro and Ultra. When is it coming? Yeah, so the smallest one would be also like 6.3 inches. You can also expect HDR, and then it would go to up to 6.8. So it would be very similar in sizes to the Pro iPhones. Hardware, yeah, we are getting the battery capacity. I don't know if it's an increase over, like it's an increase over the specific device here, but it's an X100S, so that's not quite the same as an Ultra. Okay, but yeah, and there is like the idea that it's coming either with Dimensity 9400 or Snapdragon 8 Gen 4. Maybe that would be like a regional difference. Oh my God, there's so much. Like at this point, like I have to say, Apple rumors, as much as we complain about them, they really seem to be pretty good. Like there is so much contradictory stuff, even leading up to the release of an iPhone, of a new thing. It's just weird. How large is the Sony IMX 921? And with an it's a 1 by 1.56 inch sensor size. That's the main sensor. Why are they using such a small sensor? The X2 is also rumored to have a chip with similar sensors. Okay. Don't know if the Ultra would get noticeably different, but yeah, we might cover those devices when they're actually coming out. I don't want us to distract today too much as we're finally coming to the finish line.
也已经突破了8小时大关。
I need subtitles again.
要知道 ，iOS 17下 iPhone 15 Pro Max 的续航也不过刚刚8小时左右，所以这代 iPhone 也成了目前续航时间
I mean, that's a compliment, I guess, for iPhones. I still don't see the data that iOS 18 gives you so much better battery life than iOS 17, but maybe in their specific testing it does. Who knows?
要强调的是，除了大电池和 A18 以外 ，iOS 18新的调度策略对续航的提升也绝对功不可没啊。那这次我们在新系统下复测2款15 Pro 机型的续航，几乎原地提升了1个小时啊。 所以说，如果你用的是 iPhone 15 Pro 系列的机型啊，一定要更新一下 iOS 18系统。那这代 iPhone 的另一个重要改进是散热，苹果非常罕见的在发布会上强调了散热的增强。
They mentioned it directly with the 14 series, so every 2 years, I guess.
其实不难看出呢，这代机内结构来源于 iPhone 14和 iPhone 15。那它在屏幕下方加入了一块铝板。 来增加机身的热容量。但从目前网上流出的主板布局图来看呢 ，SoC 和基带依然是背靠背设计。那么它们具体试螺的试码，咱们还是得拉出来溜溜才知道。我们跑了30分钟的 Wildlife Extreme 压力测试。那么 iPhone 16 Pro Max 呢，似乎维持了和上代接近的解热功耗。
Again, I have no idea what this test is, like how well it actually like, because this test to me makes no sense, right? Like using like a game and then you like what? Like and then you see how much heat it dissipates? How does that work again? Like and again, are you looking at spikes or at average power consumption? Like do you consider how hot the device gets? Like I'm just very, very confused by this testing. It also, I don't know whether or not it includes the entire cooling capacity of the device because, for example, of course, the new metal casing battery should have much better heat dissipation. But yeah, supposedly the 16 Pro Max has lower heat dissipation than the 15 Pro Max. Quite honestly, I don't think that this is a heat dissipation metric. I think this is a power consumption metric. Maybe the 16 Plus occasionally allows for a higher power consumption spike because maybe the aluminum chassis helps with cooling a tiny bit. And also, by the way, the battery capacity is ever so slightly larger technically in the Plus. Well, it was. So I'm just like, I am very perplexed. This is not an actual heat dissipation ranking, in my opinion. It's just a power consumption metric. Like, I think they extrapolate from the iPhone using 4 or 5 watts or whatever, that it can only use that it can only dissipate that much heat instead of asking themselves if that's maybe what Apple actually just wants the power consumption to be because of battery life considerations and like even like longevity considerations, so the battery doesn't constantly heat up too much, that the silicon doesn't get so hot it starts degrading quicker, as we have seen with like some Intel's K overclock SKUs. Like, guys, let me know before, because we are basically in the final line here. Like, can you see my point here? Do you actually think that this testing is super valid?
这散热难道根本没有改进吗？那也不对呀。之前游戏测试里面
Right, so their own data contradicts this, because clearly the iPhone was fine after 5.4 watts at 30 minutes.
16 Pro Max 的频频解热功耗。
Also, by the way, again, Wildlife Extreme is actually a bad test. So we don't even know if it might be just super inefficiently like utilizing the cores and stuff like that, which again, for raw heat dissipation metric might not matter. But if you actually wanted to maybe see how the iPhone dissipates heat in an actual game, maybe that's not a good test.
不是明显高了吗？好，那我们就决定仔细看一下 log 啊，这下答案就很明显了。16 Pro Max 的降频点来得更晚。
But then why is it lower? Like, you literally said it has lower heat dissipation. That just doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. Like, by the way, and also as an overall system level heat dissipation, for example, during the Verge review that we reviewed 2 days ago, Dave said that during like 25-watt wireless charging with the latest MagSafe standard, it barely got warm, which anybody who knows of even running a 15-watt MagSafe charging on the 15 Pro Max will know that it gets beyond just a little warm. So I don't know. I feel like they really fail at actually capturing the overall heat dissipation capacity of the entire chassis. It feels like they're just measuring the power consumption and randomly deciding that because the iPhone clocked down, which maybe throttled during the test, right? That never meant that the iPhone cannot handle higher power consumptions. It just meant that Apple wants the iPhone to run at around 5 watts. That's the point here. Like, default behavior for a smartphone is different than it is for a chip, for a laptop chip, for example. Like, where with active cooling, you actually want to target like generally a high wattage, and then you would only drop that wattage if you ever if you're thermally soaked, right? If the system cannot handle more heat. Here, Apple might just give you, Apple might target 5 watts because they only want to target 5 watts, but they momentarily give you apparently 14 watts, and then they gradually reduce it so that they know, oh, okay, we don't want to overheat the system, we don't want to damage the chip, we don't want to damage the battery in the long term, we don't want to give you such poor battery life that you end up with like 1 hour of play, right? What's the watt-hour rating on the iPhone? Like 16 or 17, so that would literally result in just 1 hour of quote-unquote play. So Apple drops it to 5 watts. While on a laptop, if it goes to 14 watts, ideally, if it has active cooling, it would stay around there. Or if it doesn't have active cooling, it would maybe drop down only based on thermal. So if you connect like a fan to it, right? Because I'm sure if you connect a fan to the iPhone, it will still drop here. I'm almost sure of that because, internal temperature might be a metric as well that might push it to like 7 or 8 watts or whatever, because now Apple is less afraid of damaging the chip and the battery. But when it comes to just raw battery life concerns, I doubt that Apple ever planned on keeping the device at 14 watts.
苹果的策略是最终依然维持近似的功耗，但是延缓降频的发生啊。 其实从热成像图上很容易看到，这代的两款 Pro 机型的热分布情况很明显是比前代机型
Yeah,
要均
so
匀了。
apparently the 16 Pro, that like objectively when you look at it here, right, it runs apparently at a lower maximum temperature, 46.8 degrees versus 47.1 degrees. It clearly dissipates the heat better across the entire surface. Supposedly this device, then what? Like, what? Didn't it have like lower heat dissipation in their silly metric here? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Here. Like the 16 Pro versus the 15 Pro, 4.66 watts versus. No, that's just the power consumption. That's not the heat dissipation level. Okay. Okay. Now I actually understand their problem. Now, okay. Now I fully understand. They believe that they believe that the heat dissipation metric of a device, which should be a purely physical metric, like based on the raw physics of the iPhone's cooling system, which has definitely improved just when you look internally into the iPhone, they believe it should come almost automatically with higher sustained power consumption, even though that's like, for example, the Switch 2, as I said, is targeting like very, very low wattage levels, but it will be objectively much more efficient, and it supposedly has some much better cooling system as well. So, but according to their metric, because the actual power consumption would be lower, now the heat dissipation would be, which of course, okay, I get it now. I get the issue here.
降频的发生啊，是比的最高温点也会更低啊。不过这个散热改进啊，说实话跟安卓阵营还是有很大的差距。它既没有 VC 均热板，也不存在像6瓦以上的解热。
An anti-heat device at 6 watt. What the fuck is that? Is that active
换
cooling?
个 VC 均热板进去，这个才是正义啊。不过 iPhone 16 Pro 就像我们前面说的，显然存在一些固件问题啊，解热功率跑得很。
Yeah, no, I disagree. I think what you call firmware issues is Apple targeting low power consumption to give people good battery life. Okay, now I get my issue with them. Okay, now we are sort of
看看
good.
系统更新会不会有所改善吧。那么在实际开始测试这台 iPhone 之前呢，其实我并没有抱多少期待啊。毕竟从发布会上来看，这又是一次挤牙膏式的 iPhone 升级，
Toothpaste
几乎一模一
squeezing
样的
iPhone
外观
upgrades.
规格上看仅仅
Never
小幅
forget
提
the
升了
toothpaste,
SoC
guys.
不管从哪个角度来看，都完全不令人兴奋。就当我失望的拿起机器准备开测之后，却发现这代 iPhone 的实际表现明显超出了我们的预期。
By the way, you're weird if this exceeded your expectations, because going to Apple's website, by the way, Apple mentioned 20% higher sustained performance thanks to partially better cooling. Even during the event, they mentioned like 15% faster CPU performance. They mentioned better efficiency. So the exact performance is absolutely in line with what Apple promised. And those are the results you got in good tests, including games where, for example, you might go from 50 FPS to like 55 FPS, which is 10% more, but maybe those games just haven't yet been optimized, whatever. And then in the CPU, you even had like an 18% average better uplift. In some artificial benchmarks, you went higher than those 15 or 20%. But somehow you were disappointed, even though that's literally like you wanted to be disappointed in relation to this, even though that's exactly what you ended up getting. That's so weird. Sorry, I had to turn off the fan.
但是 A18 的性能和能效，机身的散热改进还是历代最强的续航。今年的 iPhone 16系列看起来就像是完美版的 iPhone 15系列，标准版的 A18 处理器更是近3代标准版 iPhone 当中最接近 Pro 的一次。我可以说，从我们
I don't know. Like the problem is, I don't know how Switch 2 will compare to this, because it really depends on what its exact, like, for one, it now seems to say that it would actually have 7500 megatransfers per second memory, which would give it the exact same bandwidth as an M4 chip. I wouldn't be inclined to believe that thanks to less cache and a very, very old CPU architecture, stuff like that, it would still, as a package, would be a lot less efficient than an M4 if you like clock it similarly, but it will just have the advantage of, for one, its CPU will probably mostly target 30 FPS games, so they can actually afford of using a very old, slow CPU architecture. Then they will probably do their best to leverage the semi-latest NVIDIA technology. So I don't know how DLSS, for example, might improve efficiency technically in a way. And so that is difficult to compare. And then the other metric is, of course, how much efficiency is gained by dropping clock speeds drastically from docked mode to handheld mode. It will efficiency increase a lot, but then how much performance do you really drop as well? So yeah, it's really hard to say. Might they even like clock the memory lower when they put it into handheld mode, maybe going from 7500 down to somewhere in the 5000 mega transfers range? Who knows? So the and of course the most important detail is actually the node that they use, because supposedly it was coming from Samsung's 8 nanometer node to what now would technically be a 7 nanometer node, which is a slight refinement. But I promise you, once it's actually out, I will watch some reviews along with you. I might even buy a Switch 2 myself. I won't have any way to really analyze it. I won't go into like developer mode on it or something like that, but it will be interesting.
Geekerwan 对于能效的评判标准来看，这是继13香之后最香的一代 iPhone 了。这次除了性能能效分析之外，我们还会挑战自我，来做一做下半年新机的影像评测和5G 信号评测。为此呢，我们已经搭建了一个影像实验室。
Okay, so they will also be testing photos.
看起来啊，有个初步的好消息，那就是这代 iPhone 相机的锐化现象似乎有所改善了。那反正后面呢，我们还会深度的用实拍加上理论。
It feels like they're maybe biting off a little bit more than they can chew. Like now they want to do camera reviews and stuff like that. I hate that in offline mode I cannot even just click on the channel. Geekerwan. So maybe because they're trying to do so much, they thought it would make sense to keep translating videos. So the Johnny Cerrucci video, I don't know what it is. Then they made the videos supposedly on Intel chips failing. They benchmarked Black Myth Wukong. They benchmarked Zen 5, which, by the way, just so you know what gets views on their channel, this is MediaTek 9300. This is Zen 5. Below 150, below 100K, below 100K after a month. Here's Apple after a day, over 200,000 views already. Same with the M4 here, very much sticking out over like the Kirin 910, 350,000. So yeah, M3 here 180,000, still a lot higher than the rest. The RG8 Pro. Here was the Dimensity 9300 when it was new. That got good views, but still lower than this M3 video. The Snapdragon X Elite, well, that was before it came out. Did they not test the Snapdragon X Elite? Did they get so bored of covering the news? Or is that, well, 3 months ago is still too early as well. Well, kind of. I guess that's when you early get it, but that's still Computex impressions. So where's the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3? The Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is the only video to rival their Apple-like views, and the only one to beat it at 400K, but then still lose against the A17 Pro video with basically exactly 400K. So they're definitely interested in making their iPhone reviews spicy, but covering desktop, covering like graphics, covering PC games, I feel like it's getting a little much. I feel like this is straining like a lot of good practices. If maybe they're like, maybe with like heat dissipation, they just took what they learned from like laptops and desktops, and they're just believe that phones should behave the same. This is why they've multiple times complained about firmware issues on the A18 Pro, even though literally nobody else has said something like that, and they just want higher sustained power consumption, even though maybe it wouldn't even scale performance too much better. Like maybe Apple thinks, well, we could give you 10% higher power consumption easily, slightly above 5 watts, maybe close to 6, but performance would stop scaling really well, right? Maybe with that 10, 15, 20% higher power consumption, or actual performance uplift is only half as much, so 5 to 10%. Right? And that's Apple's decision, but they call it like a firmware issue. Like, I am just flabbergasted, honestly, by some of the choices. Again, there still might be a language barrier thing, but honestly, now that I've streamed this video for almost 2.5 hours, I'm still inclined to say that I'm not a big fan of their methodology. This contrast between completely artificial benchmarks and deriving data about efficiency from them. And then once we actually get into like real world results, somehow those efficiency like stats don't really transfer there. And of course, just the rhetoric, I guess, in some ways, like calling the fact that the A18 doesn't behave the way they exactly want to, like a firmware issue. When I would call, for example, what the A17 Pro had, a firmware issue where it could overheat because it just overused itself even without running actually into that much higher clock speeds or whatever. That was a firmware issue that coincided with like bugs in certain apps like Instagram. But this, I don't know, this just feels misguided to me. You can let me know if you agree with that or disagree with that. Overall, I guess my statement is those are pretty good chips by themselves. I think their upgrades are absolutely in line with just what Apple's promises on their website. I think the fact that they give you 15 or 20% faster performance while basically consuming the exact same amount of watts is, and while actually giving you much better thermals, which is what we have found in most tests thus far, is very impressive. Is it absolutely game-changing? Clearly not. Otherwise, I would have bought those devices even over my 15 Pro Max. But yeah, I don't think that I will ever rely on Geekerwan as some kind of end-all, be-all. I still have questions about if their side-loading stuff impacts something. I still have questions about their more extreme cooling for like highest power consumption metrics, like if that is really relevant on a smartphone where it's also hard to isolate certain power consumption like between GPU, CPU, overall SoC, overall motherboard. I don't know if they actually have that deep insight into iOS, into basically the BIOS of an iPhone to actually control any of that. Yeah. This is why I usually prefer stuff like that. Shout out to DameTech. Now he hasn't yet done any 16 Pro stuff, but like he tests actual devices. He will tell, like, he doesn't even always make it like a side by side. He will just say, oh, here are the settings, here's the device, here's for how long it ran, and basically like use that to compare it with maybe some other data. Or here's like a comparison between the S24 Ultra and the 15 Pro Max, and you will find that the iPhone more often than not definitely wins against the S24 Ultra. And then a device that is very gaming focused, like the ROG devices, might match the iPhone with the A17 Pro and beat it once you consider that the iPhone actually, yes, will throttle quicker than those devices, but then those devices will, of course, come with a completely different power consumption characteristic. In that regard, it stops being a benchmark of the actual chip, and because if you actually want a result of an actual chip, here is the A15 beating the Galaxy S24 Ultra, so a 3-year-old iPhone chip at that point. And that is because in the iPad mini, which of course has a full-on aluminum unibody chassis, the heat dissipation just works much better than with a glass back on an iPhone or even with titanium sides. Of course, you have much more surface area here. So this idea that even when they complained about the amount of memory, it's very clear that decently optimized games can run on 4 and 6 gigabyte systems pretty well. But yes, a more intensive benchmark like Steel Nomad Lite, if their baseline becomes 8 gigabytes, that's of course fine. Apple cannot change anything about it. But here you have like the A15 with 3 times less memory, lower memory bandwidth. But yes, because it can use more power, now it's faster. So actually comparing just the chip becomes much more difficult as you look at devices with vastly different cooling systems, different sizes. Like the 16 Pro, for example, they shit a little bit on the 16 Pro because supposedly they wanted to just run on the same power consumption as the 16 Pro Max, even though it does have a smaller battery. But yeah, so Dame Tech, shout out to him. I don't know how good his tests are, but I know he does plenty. Mr. Mac right. And he does also cover stuff like new games actually coming out. That way you are informed. He will sometimes do like memory difference tests between like M4 iPad Pro and 16 gigabyte version, between 8 gigabyte M4 and 16 gigabyte. So shout out to that. Yeah, so I just wanted to say there are people still doing a good job. The fact that I'm not a huge fan of Geekerwan is doing here should probably tell you something. Or you just think I'm an Apple shill because they didn't say it's the best chip ever made, that because they didn't kiss Johnny Cerrugi's feet during the interview, that I'm biased or bad. That's completely up to your discretion. But that's my impression for now of Geekerwan's review of the A18 and A18 Pro. And as reviews from guys like these come out, I will be very much looking forward to including their data and creating a very comprehensive data analysis for all of us that we can keep using year over year. Maybe with the A17 as a baseline will be also interesting because we won't, of course, like compensate for factors like more memory bandwidth or eventually more memory in general. But for example, I would like reviewers to compensate for the fact that in a benchmark, one device might run at 25% higher resolution, right? At that time, the efficiency calculation, if it gives you even 90% of the frame rate at 20% lower power consumption, it's just the efficiency difference is just so huge, at least like around 30-40%, that I don't like when people don't really mention how serious that is. One thing that, for example, Dame Tech does pretty well is that he will always acknowledge that like how different the settings are, how different the resolutions are, that maybe sometimes, like, he will usually, of course, try to use the same resolution and settings, but sometimes you simply cannot do that because the device doesn't give you the exact same settings between iOS and Android. And even as we have seen, even like in the Geekerwan video, sometimes they don't give you the same resolution settings between bigger devices and smaller devices, between devices with slightly different pixel densities. So I really like it when reviewers acknowledge that, and shout out here again to Dame Tech for actually doing so. Yeah, but that about it concludes it for today's video. This did turn out longer than I thought because we, of course, went on a big fact-checking mission between like the actual core composition of the Dimensity 9300, Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, 8 Gen 4, 9400, all that stuff. Of course, we still have to somewhat reconcile it all with like real world results. Like for example, we saw them giving you like 2300 results for single core on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. Like one of the most popular devices with that chip will never basically give you that. And we saw them measuring the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 at like 7500. Again, real world results might fall far short of that, and far short to me is like 10%, because 10% is arguably almost a generational difference now with how small the generational differences actually have become on smartphones. Yeah, of course, I'll keep you posted. Definitely the loser in all of that is still the Pixel 9 Pro, which just recently came out because, of course, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is about to get upgraded. The Dimensity 9300 is about to get upgraded. And the Pixel, oh, the poor guy, is technically on a very new processor, but that processor absolutely stinks. So at least we can come together in mourning the terrible choices that were done here. And yeah, of course, real battery life test. Of course, we have seen some differences between individual reviewers. We saw like Mr. Who's the Boss, where the S24 Ultra still won, but where the 16 Pro Max still gave you like 2 hours longer than the 15 Pro Max. We had like the Tech Chat video that gave you also 2 hours longer, but then the iPhone 16 Pro Max was notably better than the S24 Ultra in that testing. We had, of course, their testing that also showed somehow iOS 18 itself improving battery life. So again, you can take those individual results as you want. Maybe, like, I wouldn't say it makes sense to average them all out, but maybe just consider them all in the back of your head, that depending on your use case, you might see wildly different results than you would expect from just picking up. Well, of course, iPhones are pretty consistent, but if you just expect certain result from a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 devices, we saw how different the Xiaomi 14 Pro compared versus like the I believe it was the Vivo that they used there. Yeah, so just consider all of that. And of course, in terms of cooling, I have to say this is one thing that really became clear to me. Their heat dissipation metric has absolutely nothing to do with actual heat dissipation. They themselves said, oh, the devices have actually had better cooling, and real world games actually prove that. But then when we ran Wildlife Extreme, which again, as I've said also time and time again at this point, is notoriously updated, not very good, but also its power consumption metric will still depend on just how much power Apple wants to give it. Yeah, this is where, to me, there is a cognitive dissonance there, where their artificial benchmarks don't line up well with their real world results, and then their real world results don't line up well with their final statements, where they try to sort of run an artificial benchmark almost like it's a real game, and then they will try to take one piece of data which is objective, like power consumption, and use it as a substitute for another piece of data, like heat dissipation metric, even though that might not be the same thing. Like, for example, if your AMD CPU runs at 125 watts on a 200 watt cooling system, that doesn't magically downgrade your 200 watt cooling system down to 125 watts. That's just not how it works. And I think that this is something that they, as somebody who supposedly tests desktop components, should really know. I mean, they do really here include like the latest Noctua cooler. I think it is the newest one. So I'm just a little confused by it all. I'm not trying to shit on them. Hey, I'm much smaller creator. My one channel is 4 times smaller than theirs. My video views are like 20 times lower than theirs, to 50 times lower. So again, I'm definitely not hitting downwards here in any way. Just trying to give you my impressions, my opinions. and giving you one last shout out to do all the YouTube jazz, because I do want to now start wrapping it up. You got more than enough conclusions from me today. As always, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment on the video after it's been just uploaded. That helps tremendously with the algorithm. It helps attracting new people. Whenever you catch me live, please consider donating in a small way in the form of a super chat or a super sticker, or consider becoming a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Fizz, Angelica, and Maximus, whole MarkTech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube, or you can also become a supporter over on Patreon. And that's about it for today's video. Thank you so much for tuning in, for making this a lively live chat. I might take the day off tomorrow and be back on Sunday, or might take 2 days off. I'll let you know. Might also stream both days if there's actually interesting data. But if you follow me on Twitter, I will definitely let you know sometime tomorrow. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much. See you guys next time. Let me know what you would like to see we can cover next, of course, as we have a lot of data with all the iPhone 16 stuff. And I'll see you guys then. Thank you so much. This is MarkTech, tuning out.